your grandmother never measured a thing. She poured oil by feel, tested doneness with a broomstick straw, and knew a pot of beans was ready by the sound it made against the spoon. That kind of kitchen sense was never written down in any cookbook. Most of it passed from hand to hand across kitchen counters, and a whole lot of it disappeared when those kitchens went quiet. But the tricks themselves did not disappear. Number 42 will show you how a single cold potato can rescue an oversalted soup. Number 71 is a Depression-era method for stretching one loaf of bread across 3 days of meals. And number 15 uses nothing but a damp paper towel to keep fresh herbs alive for weeks. These are not culinary school techniques. These are the fixes and shortcuts that ordinary American home cooks figured out because they had no other option, and they still work today. Here are 100 oddly useful American cooking tricks that actually work. Wax paper pie crust rolling was a small, neat miracle in every baker's routine. The trick was simple. Place dough between 2 sheets of wax paper, then roll it flat without ever touching the counter. No flour clouds, no sticking, no cleaning up bits of dough from every corner. It made rolling faster and neater and helped keep the crust light. Housewives found that pie dough came out more even, less dry, and easy to lift into the pan without tearing. Wax paper acted like a gentle buffer, holding everything in place and making cleanup a breeze. In a kitchen where mess meant more work and time was precious, this trick was a quiet revolution. You did not need a fancy mat or special tools, just a roll of wax paper from the drawer and a steady hand. Even the rolling pin stayed clean, and once the pie was in the oven, you tossed the paper with no fuss. It was neat, clever, and all about working smarter. Tricks like this helped make dessert feel possible even on the busiest, tightest days, and that meant everything. Sugar syrup canning seals were a sweet solution when real canning tools were hard to find. Before vacuum lids and pressure gauges became common, families often relied on a thick sugar syrup poured directly over fruit in jars. As the syrup cooled, it hardened just enough to create a glossy seal that kept out air, moisture, and insects. This sticky barrier helped preserve both the vibrant color and the shape of whatever was inside: juicy peaches, fresh strawberries, plums, or crisp apple slices. When you opened one of those jars in the dead of winter, the fruit still looked and tasted like summer. It wasn't perfect, but it was clever. The syrup was made with nothing more than boiled sugar and water, sometimes enhanced with a squeeze of lemon juice, a cinnamon stick, or a clove for a whisper of spice. While wax sealing was also common, syrup was simpler and added flavor. It was a preservation method born out of creativity, one that turned humble pantry staples into long-lasting comfort. Today, you won't find this in many modern cookbooks or safety guides, but in hard times, it was one of many tricks that brought color and sweetness to a season that offered neither. Gravy over rice might sound like a side dish today, but in the 1930s, it was often the main event. When meat was scarce and vegetables were few, the leftover drippings from a roast, or even just some bacon grease and flour, got turned into gravy. Pour that over a pot of plain boiled rice, and suddenly you had dinner. It was salty, it was filling, and it used things that might otherwise go to waste. Gravy made even the blandest starch taste rich, and rice was a cheap staple that went a long way. Families would keep jars of fat and reuse every spoonful, sometimes adding a splash of milk or a bit of onion for extra depth. It was not about variety, it was about sustenance. One bowl of this could keep you full through a whole day's work, and that was all anyone hoped for. Some children grew up thinking this was a real meal, not realizing it was born of necessity. It was practical, thrifty, and as comforting as it was humbling. You did not need a feast. You just needed something hot, salty, and spoonable. Onion soup mix as meat marinade was one of the first true pantry hacks, and it came straight from a packet. Long before marinades came in bottled form, cooks reached for those little paper envelopes of instant onion soup mix and stirred them into everything. With just water and maybe a splash of oil, the mix became a tangy, deeply savory coating for chicken thighs, pot roast, or even pork chops. the salt, the dehydrated onion, the herbs. It was like magic in a bag. Suddenly, your dinner tasted slow-cooked without needing a spice rack. It became a staple in slow cookers, Sunday roasts, and midweek dinners that needed to feed six with not much to work with. The mix was cheap, available everywhere, and lasted practically forever in a drawer. Cookbooks and food ads praised it as flavor in minutes, and they were not wrong. Even now, some of the best meatloaf recipes still sneak in a packet. It was the kind of trick that made you look like a kitchen genius, even when all you did was open a box. Preserving eggs in water glass was a trick that kept kitchens running smoothly long before modern refrigeration became part of everyday life. Water glass, also known as sodium silicate solution, was mixed with water in crocks or jars to create the preserving liquid. Freshly laid eggs were carefully placed into the mixture, where the solution sealed their porous shells and kept bacteria out. This prevented spoilage and kept the eggs tasting remarkably close to fresh. Grandfathers and grandmothers relied on this trick to store dozens of eggs through the cold winter months when hens naturally laid fewer. Families could count on having protein for baking, frying, or scrambling even when nothing new came from the coop. The eggs stayed edible for months, sometimes close to a full year, which gave households security in times of shortage. The crocks were usually kept in cool root cellars, safe from heat and sunlight, and were checked occasionally to ensure none were cracked. It was a practice that required planning and patience, but the reward was a dependable food supply without relying on markets. Today, the method is nearly forgotten, yet it remains one of the most clever and practical survival skills of the past. Bologna salad spread was the definition of turning scraps into something special. Church ladies would grind bologna with pickles and mayonnaise, mixing it into a creamy, tangy spread that could be slathered onto white bread. It was cheap, quick, and filling, making it perfect for lunches and socials. What might have been dismissed as a lowly meat became the star of the table when served this way. The spread had a zesty kick that paired well with crackers too, making it a versatile dish for gatherings. Families appreciated it because it stretched a small amount of meat into sandwiches for a whole group. At church events, trays of bologna sandwiches wrapped in wax paper were often passed around, vanishing quickly. Children especially loved them, not knowing the spread was born from thrift. It became part of community cookbooks and was remembered fondly as a taste of simpler times. Bologna salad spread proved that resourcefulness and flavor could go hand in hand. It was not about luxury, but about making the most of what you had and sharing it generously. Stretching chili with kidney beans was a practical trick that turned a single pound of ground beef into a pot large enough to feed the whole family, and sometimes the neighbors too. Kidney beans were cheap, canned, and easy to store, and when added to chili, they gave bulk, flavor, and nutrition. Moms browned the beef with onions, poured in tomatoes, spices, and beans, and soon had a meal that felt hearty and filling, even if the meat portion was small. It was a dish that worked equally well for casual weeknights or community potlucks, proof that frugality could still deliver flavor. The beans carried the seasonings beautifully, stretching both the budget and the sense of abundance at the table. For children, it was comfort food, and for parents, it was survival strategy. Stretching chili with kidney beans was a simple yet ingenious trick that showed how every can could double the impact of precious ingredients. Corn fritters with syrup were a farmhouse favorite that combined savory strength and sweet comfort in one affordable dish, filling tables with both joy and practicality. Families stirred cornmeal together with eggs, flour, and either fresh or canned corn, dropping spoonfuls of batter into sizzling skillets until golden and crisp around the edges. Once fried, the fritters were stacked high on plates and drizzled generously with syrup, creating a dish that felt indulgent despite its humble ingredients. They could be served at breakfast alongside milk, at supper with beans or greens, or even eaten plain as a snack in between chores. The recipe stretched corn, one of the most dependable crops of rural life, into something that satisfied hunger and spirits alike. For children, the fritters were a treat, a rare bite of sweetness that carried excitement. For parents, They represented the assurance that no matter how little meat or money was available, the family could still share a filling meal together. Corn fritters with syrup were thrifty, hearty, and cheerful, a reminder that ingenuity could transform the simplest crop into comfort worth remembering. Their memory lingers as one of the cleverest meals born out of necessity. Homemade cheese straws were crunchy, salty snacks that made housewives look like professional bakers without the effort. Strips of biscuit dough were twisted with cheese powder or grated cheddar, then baked until crisp and golden. They were served at bridge clubs, parties, and holiday gatherings, vanishing quickly from trays. Their appeal lay in their simplicity, a handful of ingredients transformed into something addictive. Children munched them with tomato soup, while adults paired them with cocktails, and everyone assumed they took far more work than they did. Housewives leaned on recipes like this to show skill without expense, because flour, cheese, and butter were always cheaper than buying packaged snacks. The straws were easy to shape into spirals or sticks, and they always looked festive on the table. For many families, they became the taste of togetherness, reminding everyone that a homemade touch carried more love than anything store-bought. Pressure-cooked chicken was a revelation before slow cookers became the standard in American homes, and church ladies embraced it with open arms. Using stovetop pressure cookers, they could turn tough or inexpensive cuts of poultry into tender, juicy meals in a fraction of the time it normally took. This was a godsend for busy families and for women preparing large meals for church suppers, because it saved both hours and money. Instead of roasting for long stretches, chicken could be cooked quickly, with the pressure sealing in flavor. The meat was moist, the broth rich, and the process efficient enough to keep up with the pace of community gatherings. Recipes for pressure-cooked chicken often appeared in church cookbooks, teaching new cooks how to master the technique. For families on tight budgets, this trick meant they could make poultry stretch further without losing quality. It was clever, practical, and delicious, the kind of trick that showed church ladies always knew how to work smarter in the kitchen. Baking with sorghum syrup was a trick that came from times when sugar was too costly or scarce. Sorghum, grown in fields across the South, was boiled down into a thick, sweet syrup. It was cheaper, plentiful, and stored well, making it the perfect stand-in for sugar in cakes, cookies, and breads. Grandfathers often recalled how the deep, earthy sweetness of sorghum gave baked goods a unique flavor that store-bought sugar never matched. Families grew to love the taste, and recipes were passed down through generations. Using sorghum also meant independence, since it could be produced locally rather than purchased. During lean years, it made baking possible when other sweeteners were out of reach. A drizzle of sorghum on biscuits or cornbread was a treat in itself. It was more than just a substitute. It was a reminder of how creativity and resourcefulness kept kitchens alive. Sorghum syrup was not just sweet, it was survival made delicious. Folding leftovers into gelatin salads may raise eyebrows today, but in the 1950s it was a practical and pretty way to make scraps feel special. Housewives would take bits of ham, chopped vegetables, or even shredded chicken and suspend them in flavored or plain gelatin. Poured into a mold and chilled, it transformed odds and ends into a centerpiece. These salads might look odd to modern eyes, but back then they were admired for their color, their structure, and their thrift. You could use lemon gelatin for vegetables or tomato aspic for savory meats. It stretched small portions and added elegance to a plate, especially for luncheons or church potlucks. Kids might poke at them, but guests often smiled and served themselves a slice. It was creative, yes, but more than that, it was economical. When refrigeration was unreliable and meat was expensive, gelatin preserved and presented all at once. Housewives made the most of what was left and made it look like something fresh. Today, it seems like a trend frozen in time. But at the time, it was just smart homemaking with a little showmanship on the side. Homemade rennet for cheesemaking was not for the faint of heart, but it got the job done. Before tablets and store-bought cultures, people used what they had, often vinegar, lemon juice, or for the brave ones, a bit of calf stomach lining. The process was part science, part tradition. You warmed milk gently, stirred in the curdling agent, and waited for the magic to happen. Once it separated into curds and whey, you strained it through cloth and pressed it into soft rounds or blocks. Some added salt or herbs, others kept it plain. The taste was fresh, a little tangy, and deeply rewarding. It was not just about saving money, it was about knowing how to make food from the ground up. Today's cookbooks mostly skip this, expecting readers to start with pre-made cheese or kits. But the old method taught patience and respect for the process. Cheese was no longer something you bought, it was something you made. Jelly omelets were the kind of oddball depression dish that worked better than expected. Eggs were easier to get than meat, especially if you had chickens, but they still had to stretch. So when there was no bacon or sausage, people got creative. They spread jam or jelly inside a folded omelet and served it like breakfast dessert. Grape, apple, strawberry, whatever you had, often homemade and preserved. It was sweet, soft, and oddly satisfying. The egg and sugar made something that felt like a treat, even if it was born of necessity. For children, it was special. For adults, it was just another way to avoid waste. You could swap in stewed fruit or mashed banana if jelly was gone. It was quick, flexible, and checked every box for a depression meal. It might seem strange today, but it made sense back then. When food was limited, taste mattered more than rules. Whipped evaporated milk for desserts was the poor man's whipped cream, and for some, it tasted even better. It came in a can, sat on the shelf for months, and was far cheaper than real cream. To make it work, you chilled the can, poured the thick milk into a bowl, and whipped it hard. Some added sugar or vanilla, but it held its shape without much help. It was not as rich as real cream, but it held firm and had a clean, milky flavor. People used it in mousses, icebox cakes, and pies that needed lift without weight. It popped up in retro cookbooks as a budget topping or emergency fix. During rationing or tight weeks, it was a go-to solution. And for families who grew up with it, the taste still brings back birthdays, bake sales, and simple Sunday treats. Cooking dandelion greens for salad was a clever way of turning weeds into supper. Grandfathers knew that the bitter leaves, gathered from yards, fields, or roadsides, were packed with vitamins and minerals that families needed but often could not afford. They were washed carefully, sometimes boiled or blanched to soften the bite, and then dressed simply with vinegar, drippings, or a bit of lard. During spring, when gardens were bare and money was tight, these greens became a vital source of fresh food that cost nothing but a little effort to collect. Families gathered together to pick them, often turning the task into a small ritual of togetherness, teaching younger children how to identify the leaves. The taste was earthy and strong, but it was filling and nutritious, giving strength during lean weeks. Served alone or alongside beans, bread, or cornbread, dandelion greens added variety to otherwise plain meals. Today they are seen as gourmet items in restaurants, but once they were food of necessity. This clever foraging trick kept households alive when there seemed to be little else, a quiet reminder that resilience often grew right outside the doorstep. Egg salad mold was one of those recipes that perfectly captured the adventurous spirit of 70s cooking. Housewives would combine chopped hard-boiled eggs, mayonnaise, and vegetables, suspend it all in gelatin, and set it in decorative molds. The result was a wobbly, colorful ring that was sliced and served at luncheons or holiday tables. While it might seem unusual today, at the time it felt stylish and impressive, a departure from plain bowls of salad. Gelatin molds were trendy, and turning egg salad into one gave it both structure and spectacle. It was a way to take the familiar and make it exciting without adding extra cost. Guests admired the presentation, while families enjoyed the familiar flavor hidden beneath the shine. For homemakers, it was another trick to prove that creativity could elevate even the humblest of dishes. Hamburger helper beginnings started long before the boxed version appeared on store shelves. Moms in the 1960s were already mixing ground beef with pasta, canned tomatoes, and seasonings to create one-pot meals that stretched a small amount of meat across the entire family. It was inexpensive, filling, and customizable depending on what was in the pantry. Cheese might be added for creaminess, or leftover vegetables thrown in to bulk up the meal. These dishes were quick, practical, and comforting, which made them perfect for busy weeknights. For many households, they were lifesavers, providing variety without draining the budget. When the boxed hamburger helper finally arrived in the early 1970s, it simply packaged what moms had already been doing for years. The brand marketed convenience, but the roots of the idea came straight from kitchens where resourceful cooking had already turned thrift into tradition. Using mayonnaise in cakes was one of the best-kept secrets of thrifty kitchens, and food companies were not eager to promote it. The mayo replaced eggs and oil, binding and moistening the cake batter in one simple step. The result was a cake that stayed soft and flavorful, often fooling anyone who took a bite into thinking it was made with expensive ingredients. This hack was passed around in cookbooks and word-of-mouth recipes, proving itself again and again at church suppers and family birthdays. Housewives loved that one cheap jar of mayo could create desserts that rivaled bakery cakes without requiring costly extras. It was a trick that worked so well it became a guarded favorite in kitchens where thrift and pride walked hand in hand. Packing ice boxes with sawdust may sound unusual today, but it was once a clever way to stretch the life of ice. Families without refrigerators relied on ice deliveries, and each block had to last as long as possible. Grandfathers knew that covering the ice with sawdust slowed melting and reduced waste. Sawdust acted as natural insulation, keeping the ice solid through hot summer days. Children remembered digging into piles of sawdust at ice houses where blocks were stored before delivery. The method was messy but effective, and everyone accepted it as part of daily life. An ice box lined with sawdust meant milk stayed cooler, butter did not spoil as quickly, and leftovers could be saved a little longer. It was a small adjustment that made a big difference for households trying to stretch every dollar. Sawdust was cheap, available from lumber yards, and worked better than most alternatives. It showed how practicality often outshone modern convenience in its own quiet way. Tomato juice as a soup-based starter was one of those ideas that seemed too simple to matter, until you tried it. When canned broth was hard to find or too expensive, people needed something flavorful, shelf-stable, and easy to stretch. Tomato juice fit the bill perfectly. It added color, acidity, and a rich, savory base that made even the most basic vegetable soup taste like it had simmered for hours. It was especially popular in the 1940s and 1950s, when canned juices were lining grocery shelves and meat was either rationed or just plain pricey. Recipes would call for a cup of tomato juice, some diced potatoes or cabbage, and maybe a scoop of rice or beans. Suddenly, dinner was done. You could serve it with crackers or cornbread, or even pour it over noodles if you had them. It was quick, clean, and cost next to nothing. Some families even poured leftover tomato juice from canned tomatoes right into the pot. Waste not, want not. These soups were humble, but they were hearty, and sometimes that is all you needed, especially when times were tight. Grated raw potato pancakes were born out of pure necessity and just a little bit of grease. All you needed was a couple of raw potatoes, some flour to bind, an onion if you had it, and a hot skillet. Shred it all fine, press out the water, mix it together, and fry until golden. What came out was crispy at the edges, soft in the middle, and filling enough to count as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. These pancakes did not pretend to be fancy, they just showed up and got the job done. Potatoes were the backbone of many meals in the 1930s because they were cheap, lasted forever in storage, and grew in poor soil. You could trade for them, grow them, and feed a family for days with just a sack. These cakes were sometimes topped with applesauce or served alongside beans or eaten plain and hot off the pan. They were adaptable, frugal, and satisfying. A hot cake in a cold kitchen was enough to lift your spirits a bit. That crunch meant you were doing okay, at least for today. Gelatin from leftover soup bones was not some fancy culinary flex. It was how you made food go further when every cent counted. After stews, roasts, or broths, the bones were simmered low and slow until the liquid turned rich and jiggly once cooled. That was your homemade gelatin. No boxed packets, no artificial flavors, just bones, water, and time. You could use it to set savory aspics, stretch stews into filling cold meals, or add body to gravies and sauces. Some families poured it into molds with vegetables or meat shreds, creating those odd but beloved gelatin loaves you still hear about. It was thrift, protein, and texture all in one bowl. When chilled, it held shape like store-bought gelatin, but with flavor and nutrition store versions could not touch. Modern recipes barely mention this anymore, maybe because the process takes patience. But for families who had little to spare, it was a quiet way to hold on to every bit of goodness the meal had to offer. Crushing stale cake into dessert crumbs was the final act of rescue in a house where nothing went to waste. When a cake dried out or sat too long on the counter, housewives did not toss it in the trash. They broke it up by hand or used a rolling pin to crush it into fine crumbs. Those crumbs had plenty of uses. You could press them into a pie crust with butter and sugar, sprinkle them over puddings, or layer them into trifles. Some folks even used them as coating for fried treats or folded them into new batter. It was sweet, crumbly insurance that dessert was never far away. Cake might have gone stale, but the love behind it had not. Housewives saw these bits as building blocks, not trash. A stale dessert became the start of another. That was the magic of mid-century homemaking. You found ways to keep flavor alive. Even in the smallest scraps, there was purpose. A pantry full of ideas meant a family full of surprises. No one ever guessed that the pie crust had once been a birthday cake. And that was the point. Old-fashioned corn pudding was sweet, soft, and surprisingly hearty, especially for something that came from such humble beginnings. In the 1930s, cornmeal was dirt cheap and endlessly useful, and this dish was one of the cleverest ways to turn it into a filling side: a bit of cornmeal, water or milk, and just enough sugar to make it feel special. Eggs were sometimes added, but often it was just flour, grease, and corn. It came out like a custard or a thick bread pudding, depending on what you had. Baked slowly, it developed a crust on top and a warm, spoonable inside that made it a family favorite. People would eat it hot out of the oven or cold the next morning, sometimes drizzled with molasses or a pat of margarine. It was both side dish and dessert, depending on your mood. There were no store-bought sweets for most folks back then, so corn pudding gave just enough sugar and softness to count as a treat. And for children, it was a rare bite of comfort in a world where food often felt like medicine. It was poor man's pudding, but it tasted like something richer. Dough fluffing with vinegar and baking soda was one of those chemistry tricks that made you feel like a magician in the kitchen. No eggs? No problem. A splash of vinegar in your batter, mixed with baking soda, gave just enough lift to make pancakes, muffins, or quick breads rise like they had all the right ingredients. It fizzed as soon as you stirred it in, and you had to work fast. Those bubbles did not last forever. But if you timed it right, you got a tender crumb and a soft center without needing eggs or even milk. It was a lifesaver when rationing hit or when payday was still a few days away. Vinegar was cheap, baking soda was shelf-stable, and together they turned nothing into something. Modern recipes tend to leave this out, pushing people toward eggs or dairy substitutes. But vinegar and soda were the real original hack. They worked quietly, without a fuss, and gave families hot breakfasts and passable cakes even in the leanest times. Making gravy from pan drippings was one of those clever tricks that turned scraps into something that felt like a feast. Grandfathers did not need store-bought mixes or powders. They simply saved the grease left in the skillet after frying meat, stirred in a bit of flour, and added water or milk until it thickened. The drippings carried all the flavor from the meat, giving the gravy depth without costing a cent. This was poured over biscuits, potatoes, or vegetables to stretch small meals further. Even a plain dinner suddenly tasted hearty and comforting with gravy on top. It was an economical habit that also became a flavor tradition in many homes. The method required nothing more than patience and a steady hand at the stove. Families who grew up on meals like this remember it as the taste of home, rich and simple at the same time. Today, most people buy mixes, but the old method proved resourcefulness always tasted better. Saltine cracker pie crust was the quiet hero of the no-frills American dessert scene. Before graham crackers took over, home bakers turned to what they had: plain old saltines. Crushed up, mixed with sugar and melted margarine, and pressed into a pie dish, these humble crackers transformed into a sturdy, slightly salty base that balanced sweet fillings beautifully. You would find this crust holding up lemon chiffon pies, coconut cream, and even banana pudding. The salt gave it a surprising edge, cutting through all the sugar and keeping things from tasting one note. Sometimes cooks would toast it in the oven before adding the filling, just to give it extra crunch. And while it never became a household staple like graham cracker crusts, it held on as a clever trick among thrifty bakers. If your pantry was low and your guests were coming soon, this crust saved the day. It tasted like ingenuity, like making dessert work even when you were one step from out of options. That was the kind of creativity that turned crackers into cornerstones. Powdered milk baking was one of those quiet tricks that kept households running smoothly when the weekly grocery money did not stretch far. Housewives discovered that adding powdered milk to bread, cookies, or cakes meant saving the fresh milk for children's glasses and breakfast cereals. The powdered version blended easily with dry ingredients, gave baked goods structure, and cost less per serving than cartons of fresh milk. It was a compromise that felt almost invisible, because once mixed and baked, no one could tell the difference. Some even claimed it gave breads a slightly denser crumb, which made sandwiches hold up better in lunchboxes. This practice turned powdered milk from a pantry backup into an everyday ingredient, one that showed just how resourceful homemakers were with substitutions. It was not glamorous, but it was practical, and it allowed mothers to stretch supplies without sacrificing family traditions like fresh cookies after school. Powdered milk became a symbol of thrift masked as normalcy, proof that cleverness often lay in the smallest details of a recipe. Cracker crust pies were another example of how church ladies could take the simplest ingredients and make them shine. When flour or butter was scarce, they crushed saltine or graham crackers into fine crumbs and mixed them with sugar and a little fat to create pie shells. This meant no rolling pins, no dough failures, and no wasted ingredients. The crusts held firm enough to support creamy fillings like chocolate pudding or lemon custard. At potlucks, a cracker crust pie was a crowd pleaser because it tasted indulgent while still being practical. It was an affordable way to make dessert without relying on expensive ingredients that were not always on hand. The genius of it was how flexible the crust was, adapting to both sweet and tart fillings. Many women passed the trick along in church cookbooks, keeping it alive for new generations. It was not just a substitution, but a whole new tradition that carried its own charm. The simplicity of cracker crust pies is why they still appear in nostalgic kitchens today. They remind us that cleverness often comes from making do with what you have. Adding marshmallows to sweet potatoes was one of the cleverest ways 1960s moms turned an everyday root into something that looked like it belonged on a holiday table. Sweet potatoes were inexpensive and plentiful, but they did not always excite children or picky eaters. The solution was to mash or slice them, season with a bit of butter or cinnamon if it was available, and then crown them with a handful of mini marshmallows. When baked, the marshmallows browned and melted into a gooey topping that added sweetness and charm. This little trick transformed a cheap vegetable into a dish that felt special enough for Thanksgiving, yet practical enough for an ordinary weeknight. Families loved it because it tasted like dessert and vegetable all in one, while moms valued how little effort or cost it required. It was a dish that bridged thrift and festivity, turning plain roots into something celebratory. Even if some saw it as unusual, it quickly became a tradition that brought warmth and excitement to countless tables across America. Hot water pie was a dessert born from scarcity when milk, cream, and eggs were too expensive or unavailable. Instead of giving up on pie altogether, women created a custard-like filling using hot water, sugar, a bit of flour, and butter. The mixture baked into a surprisingly silky texture that resembled traditional pies, even though it was made from the bare minimum of ingredients. It carried just enough sweetness to feel indulgent while staying firmly within the budget of struggling families. Hot water pie became proof that determination could turn even the simplest pantry staples into something special. For many, It was a reminder that joy could be created out of very little, and that dessert was never completely out of reach. Wrapping sandwiches in wax paper rolls was the go-to method for packing love into a lunch. Plastic bags were not always around, and foil was saved for the big stuff. So housewives would roll sandwiches tightly in wax paper, sometimes tying them off with twine or ribbon. It kept the bread fresh and the filling in place, and when unwrapped, the sandwich still looked crisp, not smushed. It was part presentation, part preservation. A school lunch wrapped this way looked neat and thoughtful. For working husbands and school children alike, it was a small sign that someone had taken time to make lunch right. Wax paper had a soft crackle that was almost comforting to unfold. It did not sweat, it did not stick, and it could be tucked right back into a lunch pail when done. In an age before single-use plastics ruled the kitchen, this was the gold standard. It was clean, smart, and just a little sentimental. Pan-toasting stale bread for crumb coating was not just clever, it was essential. You did not throw out old bread. You let it dry, you crumbled it with your fingers, and you tossed it into a hot skillet to toast. No oil, no butter, just dry heat. The smell alone was comforting, warm, nutty, toasty in a way that made you feel like something good was coming. Once browned, you could crush it finer and use it to coat fish, chicken, or vegetables before frying, or sprinkle it on casseroles to give them a crisp top layer. It gave texture and taste to anything soft or soggy. Kids who grew up on this trick remember the sound of that skillet scraping across the stovetop more than they remember store-bought breadcrumbs. Today, most people buy theirs in boxes, but those never taste quite the same. Pan-toasted crumbs were a small act of resourcefulness, born from the kind of hunger that made you see potential in every stale slice. Corncob broth proved that even what looked like trash still had a job to do. After eating the corn kernels, usually boiled or cut from the cob, people would save the cobs and toss them into a pot of water. Add a few onion peels or garlic skins, and you had the beginnings of a mild, slightly sweet broth. It was not strong, but it had body. You could use it as a soup base, to cook rice or beans, or even sip it hot with a pinch of salt. Some families swore it helped stretch out meals when nothing else was left. In many kitchens, this broth was a weekly ritual in summer when corn was in season. The cobs would sit in the pot all day, simmering slowly until they gave up their last bits of flavor. It was depression logic at its finest. Do not waste what you cannot replace. Even stripped bare, the cobs still had something left to give. This broth turned scraps into sustenance, and sustenance into a survival tool. Shredded carrot in gelatin salads was a strange but oddly elegant touch that showed up all over mid-century kitchens. Back when gelatin was not just dessert, but a full-blown meal format, people liked to add texture and color to their wobbly molds. Enter the humble carrot, shredded fine and stirred into orange or lemon gelatin for a bright, crunchy twist. The sweetness of the gelatin and the mild earthiness of the carrot balanced surprisingly well, and the end result was a chilled salad that looked like sunshine on a plate. You would find it served at potlucks, funerals, church luncheons, and any meal where presentation mattered more than explanation. Sometimes folks added pineapple or raisins too, giving it a sweet-sour profile that people either loved or politely ignored. Still, the shredded carrot stuck around because it was easy, inexpensive, and made the mold feel a little more like food and less like decoration. It is one of those dishes people remember from their grandmother's house, even if they never quite liked it. But in its own weird way, it was beautiful. Making vinegar from apple scraps was an old and clever trick that turned what others considered waste into something valuable and lasting. After peeling or coring apples for pies, preserves, or snacks, grandfathers and grandmothers would gather the scraps into jars or crocks, cover them with water and sugar, and leave them to ferment naturally. Over time, wild yeasts transformed the mixture into tangy homemade cider vinegar. It required no special tools, only patience and an understanding that nature would do most of the work. Families stored these crocks in pantries or cellars where they aged until ready to use. The vinegar was versatile. It added flavor to sauces and marinades, tenderized tougher cuts of meat, preserved vegetables through pickling, and even served as a cleaner around the house. In lean years, making vinegar at home saved valuable money since store-bought versions were unnecessary. It also offered a sense of independence, knowing every part of the apple had a purpose and nothing went to waste. This practice was more than just thrifty, it was a proud example of resourcefulness and creativity. Homemade vinegar stood as proof that clever living turned scraps into sustenance and tradition. Canned milk frosting was a budget-friendly way to make desserts feel indulgent without using expensive cream. By whipping evaporated milk with sugar and flavorings, church ladies created a smooth, fluffy icing that paired perfectly with cakes or cookies. It was cheaper, easier to store, and still had the richness people craved. The trick meant even families with limited access to dairy could enjoy frosted treats. At bake sales, cakes topped with this kind of icing sold quickly because they looked just as beautiful as any bakery creation. The flavor was subtly caramelized, which made it stand out from regular buttercream. Children loved it because it was sweet and soft, while adults admired the thrift behind it. Community cookbooks often included this recipe, passing it from one household to another. It showed that indulgence did not always need expensive ingredients, just clever thinking. Frosting made this way was not only practical, but also memorable, leaving behind a taste tied to church gatherings. It was a simple solution that brought sweetness to tables everywhere. Instant mashed potato magic was one of the most useful kitchen tricks of the 1960s, turning powdered flakes into more than just a side dish. Moms discovered that instant potatoes could thicken soups, stews, and gravies, giving meals extra body without requiring flour or cream. They could also be used as a base for croquettes or patties, stretching leftovers into entirely new dishes. As a side, they were quick, affordable, and surprisingly comforting when dressed up with butter or milk. The convenience of instant potatoes fit perfectly into the rhythm of busy households, where time was short but expectations for hearty meals remained high. This clever use of a modern product showed how 1960s kitchens balanced tradition with innovation. Even if some considered them a shortcut, they became a symbol of practicality and adaptability. Instant mashed potatoes were proof that even powdered food could be turned into comfort when guided by creativity. Homemade ice cream in coffee cans turned dessert into a family game, avoiding the cost of store-bought ice cream machines. Families filled small cans with cream, sugar, and flavorings, sealed them tight, and placed them inside larger cans packed with ice and salt. Children rolled the cans back and forth across the yard until the mixture inside froze into ice cream. It was cheap entertainment, and dessert rolled into one, and everyone remembered the joy of shaking, rattling, and laughing together. Parents loved it because it used only basic ingredients and kept children busy, while the end result was creamy and satisfying. Ice cream companies certainly did not want people realizing they could make gallons of the treat at home with little effort. This trick represented both thrift and fun, proving that even luxury desserts could be created from household items and a little family effort. It was tradition disguised as play. The cheese ball party trick was a revelation in its time, and no holiday table was complete without one. Housewives mixed cream cheese with dried beef, scallions, or herbs, rolled it into a sphere, and coated it in chopped nuts to give it flair. It looked extravagant, but in truth it was inexpensive, easy, and endlessly adaptable. A few simple ingredients transformed into a showpiece that impressed neighbors and entertained guests. It became a centerpiece of cocktail parties with crackers lined neatly around it, and guests breaking off pieces as if it were something gourmet. The trick was that it could be made hours or even a day in advance, saving time for the host. Housewives loved anything that made them look polished without spending too much money or labor. It was not just cheese, it was social confidence shaped into a ball. The 70s were full of gatherings, and this recipe proved that you did not need wealth to make a statement. Stretching milk with powdered milk was a clever kitchen fix that made supplies last longer without anyone noticing. When fresh milk was limited, grandfathers would mix it with reconstituted powdered milk to increase the volume. The flavor stayed close enough that children never knew the difference, and the household budget stretched further. Powdered milk was shelf-stable, cheap, and always on hand, making it the perfect backup when fresh deliveries were unreliable. This trick was especially useful for baking, cereals, or cooking, where small changes in taste went unnoticed. Families who relied on daily milk found comfort in knowing there was always enough. It became one of those silent household practices that kept everything running smoothly. Today, powdered milk is often overlooked, but back then it was a staple that quietly carried families through lean times. It was not glamorous, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. Clever, simple, and effective, it was a survival tool hidden in plain sight. Oven-dried breadcrumb saver was less of a recipe and more of a way of life. Any time you had bread that went stale, and back then that was often, you dried it out in the oven, crushed it by hand, and stored it for later. Nothing got tossed. These homemade crumbs were used for coating fish, thickening soups, binding meatloaf, and topping baked casseroles. A batch could last weeks if you kept it dry and cool. Some people seasoned them with herbs or garlic powder, while others kept them plain and let the dish carry the flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 1950s listed breadcrumbs as an everyday ingredient, not something you bought at the store. They called them pantry gold and treated them with care. It was a small step toward stretching every meal and making use of everything, and it came with that quiet pride of not letting good food go to waste. These crumbs had a texture you could not get from store-bought. More rustic, more honest. They turned the ordinary into something that felt home-cooked and personal. Using cookie cutters for sandwich appeal was a trick every clever 1950s housewife kept in her back pocket. Lunches could be plain, but they did not have to look it. With just a press of a cutter, a square slice of bread turned into a star, a heart, or a teddy bear. Suddenly, that same old peanut butter and jelly became a little surprise tucked into a lunchbox. It was not just for kids either. Bridal showers, garden teas, and baby luncheons all saw trays of shaped finger sandwiches stacked just so. Even ham on white looked fancier when cut into circles and layered like petals. This trick was all about charm without extra cost. You used what you had and added care. It gave lunch a little lift, and for children in school or husbands at work, that small delight meant something. Housewives knew food was about more than hunger. It was about comfort, joy, and effort. A cookie cutter was not just a baking tool. It was a reminder that home cooking came from the heart, right down to the edges of the crust. Boiled apple core pectin for jams was a brilliant example of how nothing went to waste, not even the parts most of us toss. When you peeled apples for pies, sauces, or snacks, you saved the cores and skins in a pot. Add water, bring it to a boil, and simmer it down until it became thick and sticky. That cloudy, pale liquid was pure pectin, the natural thickener that made your jams and jellies set without extra sugar or gelatin. You strained it through a cloth and saved it in jars, ready to add to the next batch of strawberry preserves or grape jelly. This trick gave structure to homemade spreads and let families stretch their fruit harvest further. It also meant that one bag of apples could serve 3 or 4 purposes, not just one. Store-bought pectin became popular later, but for many years, this was the only kind you had. The trick worked best with tart apples, especially those a little underripe. It is barely mentioned now, but it was once as essential as sugar itself in rural kitchens. Hardtack with gravy was a way of reviving something almost too tough to chew into something soft and sustaining. Hardtack, that old sailor's biscuit made of just flour and water, was shelf-stable and cheap. You could find it in army rations and emergency pantries, and in the Great Depression, people brought it back out of necessity. By itself, it was like biting into a brick. But soak it in milk or water, then smother it in gravy or fat, and suddenly you had something warm and edible. The gravy could be made from bacon drippings, flour, and whatever seasonings you had on hand. Sometimes people would stir in bits of onion or mashed beans to bulk it out. The result was soft, salty, and just enough like dinner to satisfy. Kids might not have loved it, but they learned to eat it fast. It filled you up and made good use of food that was meant to last forever. In hard times, that mattered. Hardtack with gravy was a lesson in patience, in chewing, and in making do with what you had. even if what you had was practically stone. Vinegar in meringue stabilizer might not be the most glamorous kitchen tip, but it saved more pies than you can count. Mid-century bakers hated one thing above all else: weepy meringue. That sad little puddle that formed between the lemon filling and the fluffy white top was the enemy. So what did they do? They turned to vinegar. Just a teaspoon, mixed into the whipped egg whites, helped hold the structure, giving the meringue more strength and preventing collapse. It tightened the proteins, firmed up the peaks, and made for a glossier, more dependable finish. You would find this note in the tiny print of pie recipes, usually accompanied by tips like bake at low temp or spread meringue all the way to crust. It was a behind-the-scenes trick, never advertised but always appreciated. Home bakers might not have understood the science, but they knew it worked. And in an era when homemade pies were still a point of pride, a clean slice was everything. Sometimes the best tricks were the quiet ones, the ones that just made you look like you knew exactly what you were doing. Potato donuts might sound strange today, but in thrifty kitchens of the past, they were a clever way to stretch ingredients and make a treat feel more filling. Leftover mashed potatoes or grated boiled potatoes were mixed right into the dough, giving the donuts a soft, moist texture that regular flour alone could not match. A splash of milk, a spoonful of sugar, and a dash of nutmeg or cinnamon turned the plain mixture into something that felt special. Once fried, the outside crisped up golden, while the inside stayed tender and just slightly chewy. Sometimes they were dusted with powdered sugar or rolled in cinnamon sugar, and sometimes they were enjoyed plain with a hot cup of coffee. Families swore by them as a way to avoid waste, and children loved the novelty of a donut that tasted a little different. Potato donuts proved resourcefulness could turn scraps into a sweet indulgence. Using starch water for ironing was a thrifty household trick that showed nothing went to waste. After boiling potatoes or rice, the leftover water was saved instead of poured away. Grandfathers and grandmothers alike knew that this starchy liquid could be brushed, sprinkled, or sprayed onto clothes before ironing. It stiffened fabric, smoothed wrinkles, and gave shirts or linens a crisp finish that looked sharp without spending extra money. This was long before spray starch bottles lined grocery shelves, and it worked just as well. The trick was simple, effective, and completely free, making it part of weekly routines in households across America. Families appreciated the polish it brought, especially when appearances mattered at school, in church, or at the workplace. It was one of those quiet lessons in resourcefulness, showing children that clever thinking stretched what little a household had. A pot of boiled rice might feed the family, and its water could keep clothes presentable too. Clever tricks like this proved that nothing in the kitchen was ever truly wasted, and that every byproduct had another purpose. Stretching meatloaf with oatmeal was a trick that defined the frugal resourcefulness of 1960s kitchens. Ground beef was not always cheap, and feeding large families required a little ingenuity to make it go further. Moms discovered that stirring in rolled oats gave the mixture bulk, helping 1 pound of meat stretch into several hearty servings. The oats absorbed juices and flavors as the loaf baked, making the dish tender without watering it down. Kids rarely noticed the difference, especially when the loaf was topped with ketchup or tomato sauce that gave it familiar comfort. For many families, meatloaf night was a tradition, and the addition of oats made it affordable enough to keep that tradition alive week after week. It was not just about saving money. It was about preserving a sense of normalcy and abundance, even when budgets were tight. The trick was passed down through cookbooks and shared at neighborhood gatherings as a reliable way to make a meal feel complete without emptying the wallet. It remains a reminder that small substitutions can transform a single pound of meat into a dish that fed an entire table with pride. Celery leaf garnishes were one of those quiet tricks that might go unnoticed today, but meant a lot in frugal 70s kitchens. Instead of tossing the leafy tops into the trash, housewives snipped them up and sprinkled them over salads or stirred them into soups for a burst of color and flavor. The sharp, fresh taste of the leaves added brightness without costing a penny, and it gave dishes the look of careful planning when in reality it was just thrift at work. Every part of the vegetable had a role, and the leaves became a symbol of resourcefulness in meals that might otherwise feel plain. They were especially valued in broths or chicken soups, where their flavor was subtle but noticeable, lifting the dish without needing costly herbs. Guests thought it was a little flourish, a homemaker's personal touch, when really it was a way to stretch every stalk. It was a reminder that waste was never fashionable, and creativity was the true garnish of the era. Stuffed cabbage rolls with rice fillers became a staple in households that needed to stretch meat further than usual. Cooks used cheap cuts of ground beef or pork, blending them with rice and onions before rolling the mixture inside boiled cabbage leaves. The rolls were simmered in tomato sauce until tender, turning humble ingredients into a dish that looked elegant and hearty. Rice made the portions larger, feeding entire families with just a small amount of meat. Children enjoyed the warm, comforting rolls, and parents appreciated the efficiency of making food last. Stuffed cabbage rolls carried flavors of European tradition, but adapted perfectly into Southern and African American kitchens where thrift was essential. They became Sunday favorites, proof that filling food did not have to mean expensive food. This was another dish food companies ignored, because it relied on scraps and staples rather than store-bought mixes. Yet it nourished countless tables with pride. Stretching ground beef with rolled oats was not just frugal, it was necessary. Meat was pricey and often rationed, but families still needed protein on the plate. Instead of using a full pound of beef for meatloaf or burgers, housewives would mix in rolled oats. They soaked up flavor, added texture, and held the mixture together like a charm. You would never guess there was less meat. And if you seasoned it well, with onion, garlic, or even ketchup, it tasted like the full thing. Some even preferred it that way. It was healthier, heartier, and cheaper. This trick helped feed more mouths without sacrificing quality. You could get 6 burgers out of a half-pound of beef if you did it right. Housewives took pride in that. It was not about cutting corners. It was about making smart use of what you had. And in a time when every meal was cooked from scratch, that kind of ingenuity was respected. It made dinner stretch further, and everyone left the table full. Today we might call it a budget recipe. Back then, it was just how things were done, quietly clever and always thoughtful. Powdered milk foam for dessert topping was a moment of real creativity hiding in the back of the pantry. When fresh cream or eggs were out of reach, powdered milk stepped in, and with the right touch it fluffed into something that passed for whipped topping. You mixed the powder with cold water, chilled it down as much as possible, and beat it with sugar until it grew light and airy. Sometimes people added a splash of lemon juice or vanilla to round out the flavor. It was not quite whipped cream, but it was good enough to top a pudding, finish a Jell-O mold, or crown a square of sponge cake. And it made desserts feel finished, even if the ingredients were missing in action. Kids did not question it. They just remembered the sweet, creamy taste. It was affordable, shelf-stable, and dependable. That was the magic of it. Nobody uses powdered milk like this today, but it once stood in proudly when nothing else could. Crumbled biscuit breakfast bowls were a warm and simple way to start a cold morning when you had almost nothing left. The trick was to take yesterday's biscuits, already hard or going stale, break them into pieces and pour over hot milk. Add a pinch of sugar, maybe a bit of cinnamon or molasses, and let the mixture soak until the biscuit softened. What you got was something between a porridge and a bread pudding. It was not fancy, but it was filling, warm, and easy on the stomach. In the 1930s, breakfast was often made from leftovers, and this one was a favorite among both children and adults. The milk made it feel rich. The sugar gave it a sweet lift. And the biscuit? That was just doing its job one more time before being truly done. It was a gentle way to begin the day, especially when the day ahead promised to be anything but gentle. This bowl of sweet, soggy comfort was more than a meal. It was a quiet promise that even the smallest things could be made useful again. Milk toast for sick days was as gentle as food could get. It was the go-to recovery meal when your stomach was queasy, your appetite was gone, or you just needed something soft and warm. The idea was simple. Toast a slice of plain bread, place it in a shallow bowl, and pour over warm milk. sometimes sweetened with a bit of sugar, sometimes sprinkled with cinnamon. The toast softened into something halfway between soup and cereal, easy to eat and even easier to digest. For generations, this was comfort food in its purest form, especially for children, the elderly, and anyone too worn out to chew. You would find it in vintage home nurse guides, cookbooks for invalids, and even school health manuals. It was not flashy, not flavorful, but it came with a kind of tenderness that people remembered long after they recovered. A spoonful of milk toast felt like someone tucking you in. In a world full of rich broths and fancy juices, sometimes all you needed was bread, milk, and a quiet moment to rest. Smoking meat in the backyard shed was one of those timeless practices that kept food safe without refrigeration. Grandfathers built simple smokehouses from wood or stone, using controlled fires to cure meat slowly. The smoke not only preserved the meat, but also gave it a flavor unmatched by fresh cuts. Hams, sausages, and fish hung for days or weeks, soaking in the smoke until they were ready. Families relied on these sheds to store protein for months, making sure nothing spoiled when cold weather set in and hunting or farming slowed. The process took steady effort, since fires had to be tended carefully to give enough smoke without burning the meat. Neighbors often gathered at these sheds, trading advice, swapping wood types, and even sharing a portion of their catch. The smell of hickory or oak smoke drifting from the shed became part of the rhythm of rural life, something as natural as the changing seasons. It symbolized self-reliance and pride in providing for one's family with skill instead of store-bought conveniences. Today, smokehouses are rare and mostly seen as hobbies, but the tradition still stands as a clever example of survival and community bound together by food. Rice custard pudding was the perfect example of transforming leftovers into something entirely new. Instead of tossing out the rice from dinner, church ladies combined it with eggs, milk, sugar, and spices to create a creamy dessert that could feed a family. Baked until golden on top, the pudding was sweet, filling, and surprisingly elegant for such humble beginnings. At church suppers, it was served warm with a sprinkle of nutmeg or cinnamon, giving it a homely but satisfying touch. This trick kept food waste at a minimum and turned ordinary staples into special treats. Families appreciated that it made use of every grain, and children loved the soft, custard-like texture. The pudding carried with it a sense of comfort and thrift, becoming a regular in church cookbooks and family recipe boxes. It was a dish that looked backward to tradition while still feeling fresh at every table. Rice custard pudding was proof that with just a little imagination, yesterday's leftovers could be today's dessert. Corncob broth for soups was one of those recipes that showed how deep American resourcefulness really went. After eating fresh corn, you did not toss the cobs. You simmered them. A big pot of water, a few bare cobs, maybe some onion or pepper if you had it. The cobs still held sweetness and starch, which thickened the broth and gave it a soft, buttery flavor. It became the perfect base for chowders, bean stews, or simple vegetable soups. Some people even froze the used cobs for winter cooking. Nothing was wasted. This trick worked especially well in the South and Midwest, where corn was king. It made your kitchen smell like summer, even in January. These days, most people would never think to keep a cob after the kernels are gone. But for those who remember, it was like getting a second meal for free. Boiling bones for soup broth was an act of transformation, taking scraps and turning them into something nourishing and deeply flavorful. A leftover chicken carcass, beef knuckles, pork ribs, nothing went to waste. Housewives would toss the bones into a pot with onion ends, carrot tops, and peppercorns, then let it simmer low and slow. Hours later, they had a rich stock ready to be the base for a dozen different meals. No cartons, no cubes, just the honest flavor of what was left behind. It made soups heartier, gravies deeper, and even plain rice a little more special. Bones were not trash. They were the beginning of something. Housewives understood that a good broth meant tomorrow's dinner was halfway done. This was not just thrift, it was skill. Broth making was a quiet background job in the rhythm of home life. You did it while the laundry dried or while you wiped the table. It filled the house with comfort before anyone took a bite. Beet green stir-fry was a shining example of how the 1930s turned scraps into sustenance. When you bought or harvested beets, the leafy tops were never discarded. They were cooked. In fact, they were often more valuable than the beet itself. Families would wash them carefully, chop them up, and sauté them in bacon grease, lard, or whatever fat they had. Add a sprinkle of salt or a bit of vinegar, and you had a side dish that tasted far better than its humble roots. The greens were full of nutrients and gave meals color and texture. In cities and rural homes alike, people grew beets in small plots, and nothing was allowed to go to waste. These greens cooked quickly, wilted down, and took on the flavor of whatever you cooked them in. Served alongside potatoes, beans, or cornbread, they added just enough brightness to break up the monotony. It was not fancy, it was smart. Beet greens helped families stretch their gardens, their groceries, and their budgets. You might not miss them now, but back then, they made the difference between a plate that looked full and one that looked empty. Prune whip dessert was the fiber-rich cloud that showed up at church luncheons and retirement homes across the country. It was sweet, airy, and oddly elegant, made by pureeing stewed prunes, folding them into stiffly beaten egg whites, and chilling the whole thing until it held its shape. It sounds strange now, but it was a hit in the 1930s through the 1950s, especially with older folks or anyone on a digestive diet. Prunes were cheap, shelf-stable, and full of nutrients, and this dessert made them feel like a treat instead of medicine. Some cooks added a bit of lemon juice or vanilla for brightness, while others served it with a dollop of whipped evaporated milk or even custard. The result was light on the tongue and surprisingly satisfying, especially if you had grown tired of gelatin molds. It was not a dish that screamed decadence, but it whispered health, comfort, and just a little bit of sweetness. The kind you served to someone who needed a gentle dessert and a moment of peace. Pickle roll-ups became a surprise favorite in lunchboxes and potlucks, and they proved how far simple pantry items could be stretched. Housewives would smear cream cheese across slices of deli ham, place a pickle in the center, and roll the whole thing into a tidy bundle. Once sliced into bite-sized pieces, they looked almost gourmet, despite being assembled in minutes. Children loved pulling them apart in lunchboxes, while adults popped them like appetizers at neighborhood gatherings. They offered a crunchy, tangy bite wrapped in something hearty enough to pass for indulgence. Cream cheese smoothed out the saltiness, while the pickle added both flavor and texture, making it a clever balance of taste on a budget. It was proof that fun presentation could make even the simplest ingredients feel party-worthy. A few slices of ham, a jar of pickles, and some cheese created a dish that stood out on any table. Homemade grape Kool-Aid sherbet was one of those tricks that turned a simple drink mix into a frozen delight for children's socials. Church ladies mixed powdered Kool-Aid with sugar, water, and a little milk, then froze it into a sherbet that looked bright, cheerful, and fun. It cost very little to make, but felt like a special treat, especially in the heat of summer. Kids loved the vivid purple color and tangy sweetness, while parents appreciated that it could be made in large batches with minimal effort. At picnics or Sunday school gatherings, tubs of this sherbet were scooped into paper cups, leaving sticky smiles everywhere. It was a clever way to turn an ordinary drink into something memorable, stretching one packet of mix into enough dessert for dozens. The trick also reflected the resourceful spirit of the times, proving that fun did not require fancy ingredients. Homemade grape sherbet became a simple joy tied to fellowship, childhood, and the warm memory of church community. Turning rendered fat into soap showed just how little was wasted in those earlier kitchens. After roasting or frying meat, the leftover fat was collected and stored until enough was gathered for soap making. Mixed with lye and water, it hardened into bars that cleaned as effectively as anything from a store. Grandfathers remembered a time when buying soap was a luxury, and this homemade version kept households supplied. The process was smelly and messy, but the end result was useful and reliable. Every bit of animal, from fat to bone, was valued for what it could provide. This trick tied together cooking and cleaning in a cycle of practicality. Even when money was tight, families could stay stocked with something essential. It was a reminder that nothing had to go to waste, not even grease. Soap made from kitchen fat was not glamorous, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. Mayonnaise as a cake moistener sounds like a cruel joke until you taste it. In the lean years, especially during the Great Depression and into the war era, people had to get creative when they were short on eggs, milk, or butter. Mayonnaise was made with all three, and it had a smooth, fatty texture that blended beautifully into batter. So when folks wanted to bake a cake but the fridge was bare, they reached for the mayo jar. Chocolate mayonnaise cake became a sleeper hit, especially in mid-century kitchens. It was rich, dark, and impossibly moist, with a texture that stayed soft even days after baking. Cookbooks started including mayo cakes as their own category, with variations that included nuts, cinnamon, or even applesauce. Brands caught on too. Some even printed the recipe on the side of their jars. You could always tell someone grew up during hard times if they looked at a cake and guessed the secret ingredient right away. To this day, some home bakers still swear it is the only way to make a chocolate cake that never dries out. Strange as it sounds, mayonnaise made cakes better, and no one questioned it. Molasses milk was poor man's cocoa, and for many families it was the closest thing to a sweet treat they could manage. All it took was a splash of hot milk, sometimes powdered, sometimes fresh, and a spoonful of molasses stirred in. The result was dark, rich, and full of iron, with a strong flavor that kids either loved or learned to tolerate. It had warmth, it had sweetness, and it came with none of the cost of chocolate, which had all but vanished from most households during the 1930s. Molasses was one of the most common sweeteners at the time because it was cheaper than sugar and had a longer shelf life. It also felt hearty, like something that was doing your body good, even if the cupboard was nearly empty. Some families drank this before bed. Others served it in place of breakfast. It was a quiet comfort, often ladled out in chipped mugs, handed off with a tired smile and a reminder to sip slowly. Molasses milk might not sound glamorous today, but back then, it tasted like safety. And that was worth more than anything else. Onion skin dye for pickled eggs was one of those beautiful accidents that turned necessity into tradition. When eggs were hard to come by and pickling became a way to preserve what little you had, people looked for natural ways to add color and depth to the brine. Boiling onion skins, red or yellow, released pigments that stained the eggshells and even tinted the whites with subtle amber or rose tones. It was a quiet, rustic kind of beauty. No artificial dyes, no fancy techniques. Just leftover peels that most folks would have tossed. The flavor stayed the same, vinegary, firm, and savory. But the look was something else entirely. These eggs were packed into jars, gifted during holidays, or brought out when guests came over, turning frugal food into something you could be proud of. The trick is almost forgotten now, replaced by food coloring or store-bought brines. But for those who remember, it was always a little bit of magic pulled from the scraps. Reheating cold biscuits with a damp towel was one of those little touches that made leftovers feel fresh again. When dinner rolls or breakfast biscuits turned dry overnight, you did not toss them. You brought them back to life. Housewives would dampen a clean kitchen towel, wrap the biscuits inside, and heat them in a warm oven for a few minutes. The steam worked its magic. Biscuits softened up, regained their warmth, and felt nearly fresh baked. This trick made second-day meals feel like first-class dining. It took 5 minutes, no extra cost, and 0 complaints at the table. In homes where everything counted, even baked goods got a second chance. The towel trick was simple, quiet, and incredibly satisfying. It meant care. It meant a kitchen that did not quit. And most importantly, it meant feeding your family without apology. These little flowery rounds of comfort came back fluffy, warm, and ready to be slathered in butter. All because someone took the time to do it right. No shortcuts, just smart ones. Pineapple upside-down bundt cake was one of those whimsical desserts that instantly caught attention on a 70s table. Housewives already knew the appeal of the classic pineapple upside-down cake, but baking it in a bundt pan gave it height, curves, and a presentation that seemed far fancier than the ingredients suggested. Canned pineapple rings, bright red cherries, and sticky brown sugar glaze lined the bottom of the mold, so when it was flipped out, it looked like something pulled straight from a magazine. Guests thought it was sophisticated, but the truth was it took no more effort than the original recipe. It was a playful nod to the growing trend of bundt pans in every kitchen, where recipes could be repurposed for new shapes and styles. Housewives leaned on this trick whenever they needed to impress without the fuss of pastries or layered cakes. The cake looked polished, tasted rich, and had the bonus of stretching one can of fruit into a dessert that fed a crowd. It was a dish that celebrated presentation as much as thrift, showing how far creativity could take you. Cereal box recipes for marshmallow squares might have been advertised to sell the cereal, but resourceful moms quickly figured out endless spin-offs. The classic crispy rice treat was just the start, with marshmallows melted into butter and mixed with cereal before being pressed into pans. Mothers experimented with other cereals, from cornflakes to wheat puffs, making variations that were cheaper and often tastier than the boxed desserts. The trick was using whatever was on hand, proving that recipes were guides, not rules. This cleverness saved money while still giving children the fun snacks they craved, without relying on the company's packaged versions. It showed how families took corporate marketing and turned it into something of their own, stretching products further and reclaiming control over what they ate. Cottage cheese with fruit as dessert was a reflection of both thrift and the health craze that swept through the 1960s. Cottage cheese was inexpensive, high in protein, and versatile, making it a favorite for moms who wanted nutritious yet budget-friendly meals. Pairing it with canned peaches, pineapple, or fresh berries turned it into a dish that looked and tasted like dessert without the cost of cakes or pies. Kids enjoyed the sweetness of the fruit, while parents felt good about serving something lighter and healthier. This trick fit perfectly into the culture of the decade, where diet foods and health trends were rising in popularity. It was quick, affordable, and practical, proving that desserts did not always have to be elaborate to be satisfying. Families remembered it fondly because it struck the right balance between indulgence and restraint, giving everyone a taste of sweetness while still keeping meals wholesome and economical. Pineapple cheddar casserole was one of those quirky pairings that defined the era. Housewives mixed sweet pineapple chunks with sharp cheddar cheese, baked it into a casserole, and served it alongside ham or pork at Sunday dinners. The sweet and savory combination surprised many, but it quickly became a favorite in community cookbooks. It was thrifty, since canned pineapple was affordable and cheddar stretched protein-heavy meals further. The dish struck a balance between novelty and tradition, standing out at gatherings while still being comforting. Families came to expect it during holidays, and housewives relied on its dependable ease. Its charm lay in the way it transformed two ordinary ingredients into something unforgettable, sparking conversations at dinner tables across the country. Cinnamon sugar pie crust twists were one of those clever snacks that made sure nothing ever went to waste in a church kitchen. When there was leftover pie dough from baking, it was rolled out, brushed with a little butter, and sprinkled with sugar and cinnamon before being cut into strips and baked until crisp. What came out of the oven were sweet, flaky little cookies that filled the kitchen with the smell of spice. They were perfect for children who came running in after service, eager for a bite of something warm. These twists were quick to make, cost nothing extra, and gave a sense of thriftiness that still felt indulgent. At church socials, trays of them would disappear in minutes because they were easy to grab and eat by hand. Many families passed down this trick as part of their pie baking routine, treating it as the baker's reward for making dessert. They were a small joy born from careful use of every scrap, and their memory lingers in the kitchens where nothing was ever wasted. Using coffee grounds to deodorize the fridge was one of those tricks that seemed odd until it worked. Back before baking soda became the default fix, housewives would scoop yesterday's grounds into a bowl and place it quietly on a refrigerator shelf. The grounds soaked up odor without adding any strange smell of their own. It was quiet, reliable, and made use of something already on hand. Housewives loved finding second lives for everyday items, And this one was a winner. If your fridge started to smell like onions or last Sunday's roast, the grounds pulled the stink right out. And they did it naturally. No chemicals, no fuss. Plus, it made opening the door a little more pleasant, especially with company around. You might not think about it today, but back then, no one wanted their butter tasting like cabbage. This little trick helped keep flavors clean, meals fresh, and dignity intact. It was one more example of turning waste into usefulness and making the kitchen work smarter, not harder. And when you are running a household on a shoestring, that kind of wisdom matters more than anything. Mayonnaise cake moisture hack was a quiet baking miracle that nobody saw coming, until they tasted it. In lean times, when you didn't have fresh eggs, butter, or milk, you reached for a spoonful of mayonnaise. It sounds bizarre today, but back then it was a stroke of culinary genius. Mayonnaise is, after all, just egg yolk, vinegar, and oil. Exactly the building blocks a cake needs to rise and stay moist. When mixed into a chocolate batter, it transformed the crumb into something soft, rich, and almost fudge-like. Even picky eaters didn't know the secret. You could serve it at birthdays, potlucks, or even Sunday suppers, and not a soul would guess what was inside. It worked with lemon cake, spice cake, even banana bread in a pinch. It didn't matter what brand you used, store-bought or homemade, it all added the right kind of richness. Long before vegan substitutions and plant-based baking went mainstream, people used what they had and made it work. Some families kept the recipe secret. Others passed it down proudly. Either way, this strange little trick proved that resourcefulness could taste like celebration and that a spoonful of something unexpected could bring joy to the table. Rice-stuffed baked apples were one of those meals that towed the line between dinner and dessert. Apples stored well through winter, and rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook. Together, they made something practical and gently sweet. You hollowed an apple, stuffed it with cooked rice, and baked it until it softened and started to collapse. If you had cinnamon or brown sugar, great. If not, a pat of lard did the trick. Some added milk to make it creamier. It was not fancy or meant to impress, but it filled stomachs and made children smile. In a time where smiles were hard to come by, that counted. These apples were often served after a bowl of soup or beans as a way to end on something soft. They warmed the kitchen and reminded folks that even hard times had gentle endings. Hot dog octopus garnish is what happens when creativity meets childhood joy. Mid-century party cookbooks, especially the ones aimed at birthday parties or school lunches, loved a good gimmick. And turning an ordinary hot dog into a smiling octopus? That was peak culinary fun for kids. The trick was simple. Slice one end of a hot dog into strips, boil it for a minute or two, and watch the legs curl outward like tentacles. The result was a goofy, wiggly hot dog that looked like it belonged in a cartoon and tasted like backyard summer. Parents would set them on top of mac and cheese, mashed potatoes, or even tuck them into lunchboxes with a smiley face drawn in mustard. It cost next to nothing but made kids feel like they were eating something special. These octopus dogs became so popular that some cookbooks devoted whole sections to fun food just like it. It was a different kind of food styling, one that made meals exciting without any fuss or frosting. And really, when you are 5 years old, who would not love a sea creature made of meat? Bread and butter pickles were one of those recipes that lived in mason jars stacked in church basements and kitchen cupboards, ready to be pulled out at any gathering. They were sweet, tangy, and crunchy, and they made even the simplest meal feel special. Church ladies often used up garden cucumbers this way, slicing them thin and layering them with onions, sugar, and vinegar. This not only preserved the harvest, but also added variety to meals when fresh produce was scarce. The cleverness was in how long they lasted, because jars could sit sealed for months until they were needed. At potlucks, a plate of bread and butter pickles was never just a side dish. It was a reminder of planning, patience, and care. They dressed up sandwiches, balanced out heavy casseroles, and added brightness to plates full of starches and meats. Kids might sneak them from the jar before supper, while adults savored their nostalgic flavor. Making these pickles was more than just cooking. It was part of the tradition of feeding not just one household but the entire community. They were sweet in flavor and sweet in meaning. Using cold cellars instead of refrigerators was a practice rooted in necessity. Grandfathers dug cellars into the earth or used existing basements to store food at a steady, cool temperature. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes were kept in bins of sand or sawdust to preserve them for months. Apples were stacked carefully, and cabbages hung from rafters to slow spoilage. The earth itself provided the refrigeration, keeping food edible long after harvest. This system meant families could rely on their crops through the winter without needing electricity. It also gave a sense of security, knowing that there was always something stored below ground. Visiting the cellar to gather ingredients was part of daily routine, a reminder of careful planning and foresight. Today, we take freezers for granted, but once it was a point of pride to keep a cellar stocked. Clever, reliable, and simple, it was one of the most effective survival tricks of the time. Grape jelly meatballs sound strange, but in the 70s, they were the darling of every cocktail party. Housewives simmered meatballs in a sauce made from grape jelly and chili, creating a sweet and savory flavor that felt completely new. Guests were surprised by the unusual pairing, but one taste kept them coming back. They became a staple of potlucks and gatherings, feeding a crowd with very little effort. The sauce was cheap, the meatballs could be stretched with fillers like breadcrumbs, and the result felt festive. Housewives loved how little time it took to put together, and partygoers remembered it long after the evening ended. It was another example of a clever trick making use of common pantry items to create something memorable. Even today, people who grew up in the 70s remember those saucy meatballs with nostalgia. It was proof that daring combinations could win hearts when money and time were short. Crock-pot stews with budget cuts became a hallmark of clever 1960s cooking as slow cookers began finding their way into more households. Tougher cuts of meat that were cheaper at the butcher could be transformed into tender, flavorful meals after hours of slow simmering. Moms would add potatoes, carrots, onions, and broth, letting everything meld together while they went about their day. The result was a warm, hearty stew waiting by dinner time, made possible by a method that turned thrift into comfort. This trick saved money, reduced stress, and kept family meals consistent even in busy households. It also marked a shift toward modern appliances, making life easier while still honoring the tradition of cooking from scratch with what was available. Kids loved coming home to the smell of a crock-pot meal filling the house, and parents appreciated how far it stretched the grocery budget. Crock-pot stews with budget cuts were more than food, they were a sign of changing times, where clever tools and resourceful recipes kept families fed and happy. Powdered milk in creamy sauces was a quiet substitution that made casseroles and soups taste rich even when cream was out of reach. Housewives mixed powdered milk with water and whisked it into gravies, macaroni dishes, and vegetable bakes, giving them body and flavor without needing fresh dairy. It became a hidden tool in households where budgets were tight, and it fooled guests who never realized they were eating something stretched with substitutes. Powdered milk was cheap, shelf-stable, and reliable, which made it indispensable in kitchens that had to plan for lean weeks. Families appreciated that meals still tasted indulgent without draining resources, and children never knew the difference. It was a trick companies did not advertise because they would rather sell real milk or cream, but for housewives, it was proof that ingenuity mattered more than marketing. This substitution made countless casseroles creamy, filling, and memorable without costing more than a few pennies. Powdered milk to bulk up regular milk was not glamorous, but it sure was dependable. In big families with small budgets, milk disappeared fast, so housewives made it stretch by mixing whole milk with reconstituted powdered milk. You took a scoop of the powder, stirred it with water, and poured it into the fresh stuff to double the supply. It was not just thrift, it was survival. This trick made sure every child got a glass at breakfast, every recipe had enough for batter, and every cup of coffee got its splash of creaminess. Did it taste different? A little. But after a while, no one noticed. It became part of the routine. When you have mouths to feed and only so much to go around, A full jug matters more than the taste of a second pour. Powdered milk also stored longer and did not require refrigeration until mixed. That made it perfect for backup in a pinch. Housewives kept boxes in the pantry like it was gold dust. And truth be told, it kinda was. It gave a little more breathing room to a grocery bill that was already tight. Soup jar layering was what you did when the fridge was filled with almost empty pots and bowls. It wasn't a fancy technique, it was survival with a creative twist. When you had a little bit of leftover vegetable soup, a spoonful of bean chili, half a cup of chicken noodle, and a ladle of creamy tomato, you didn't throw any of it out. You poured them, one on top of the other, into a glass jar. The layers formed colorful stripes: green, red, yellow, beige. Some families even called it striped stew. Once the jar was full, it went into the fridge. And when it was time to reheat, you dumped the whole thing into a pot and stirred gently over low heat. The flavors blended, clashed, or occasionally surprised you. Sometimes you discovered a new favorite. Other times, it just tasted like Thursday. But it always felt thrifty. Each jar was a record of the week's meals: what was served, what was saved, and what was never wasted. In homes where food stretched far and memories were short, these jars did more than hold soup. They told a story, and in their quiet, unglamorous way, they made the most of everything. Apple skin tea was what you made when even the scraps had scraps. In homes where nothing went to waste, apple peels left over from canning or pie making were gathered and boiled into a weak but fragrant tea. It smelled sweet like cider, even if the taste was faint. Sometimes people added cinnamon sticks or cloves, but most of the time it was just water and skins. Served hot, it warmed your hands and gave you the sense that you were drinking something more than water. In a time when every ingredient had to pull double duty, this was how you honored what little you had. Apple skin tea was often sipped at night after supper when the fire had burned low and the day's work was done. It was not about nourishment so much as comfort. A hot mug of anything in the Great Depression was an act of care. You felt it going down, slow and steady, and it reminded you that sweetness could still be coaxed from the barest leftovers. Oatmeal meat extender was one of the smartest tricks to come out of wartime cooking, and one of the least noticed. The idea was simple: take a little meat and make it go further by adding rolled oats. Mixed with ground beef, eggs, and seasonings, the oats absorbed flavor, held moisture, and blended in so well that most people did not even notice. They made the meat stretch without sacrificing texture, and they were cheap, filling, and always on hand. This trick became especially common in meatloaf, burgers, and even meatballs, anywhere a little extra bulk was needed. Cookbooks from the 1930s and 1940s praised it as a nutritious alternative or thrift-friendly filler. Some families used it so often that it just became the default. You might even say the oats carried the meal without getting credit. That is what made it brilliant. It was not flashy, but it worked. And when you were feeding 6 people on a 2-pound package of meat, that quiet brilliance made all the difference. Mayonnaise chocolate cake sounds like the oddest pairing, but to a 70s housewife, it was a lifesaver. Eggs and oil were not always affordable or plentiful, and mayonnaise carried both of those ingredients in one neat jar. What might have started as a depression trick found new life in suburban kitchens where dessert could not be skipped. The mayo kept the cake moist and soft, which made it a reliable favorite even when pantry shelves looked bare. Housewives served it at birthday parties, neighborhood gatherings, and even slipped it into lunchboxes, and no one ever guessed the secret ingredient. The kids were thrilled, the neighbors thought it was genius, and all it took was 1 jar of mayonnaise. For a generation that had been raised on thrift and taught to make do, this was proof that simple pantry swaps could feel indulgent. It turned an ordinary chocolate cake into something special that lasted longer and stayed fresh even days later. What mattered was not telling anyone how it was made, because the taste spoke for itself. Cornflake-topped casseroles were the crunchy secret to making church suppers feel just a little more exciting. Instead of breadcrumbs, which were not always available or affordable, Women crushed cornflakes and sprinkled them over the top of creamy dishes. The flakes baked into a golden crust that added texture and flavor. It was a clever way to use a cereal that was already in most kitchens, turning breakfast into a topping. At potlucks, casseroles with that golden crunch always stood out on the table, drawing hands before the plain versions. Whether it was potatoes, green beans, or noodles, cornflakes added that extra layer of satisfaction. The idea spread fast through church cookbooks, and soon nearly every family had their own spin on it. It made sense because it saved money, reduced waste, and delivered results people loved. The topping was also fun for children to help make, crushing the cereal into crumbs before baking. Over time, cornflake casseroles became a defining dish of community meals, carrying with them the spirit of sharing. They were simple, affordable, and unforgettable, just like the gatherings where they were served. Peanut butter meatballs may sound strange to modern ears, but in kitchens where thrift ruled, they became a clever and dependable dish, balancing cost and nourishment. Meat was expensive, scarce, and often rationed, so housewives stretched it by mixing ground beef or pork with spoonfuls of peanut butter. The peanut butter added bulk, fat, and protein, making the dish more filling while masking the fact that the meat portion was smaller than usual. Rolled into balls and simmered in sauces or gravies, they took on a flavor that was surprisingly hearty, especially when served with rice, noodles, or mashed potatoes. Children embraced the taste quickly, since peanut butter was already beloved at snack time, and parents appreciated how far the mixture could be stretched. For many households, this trick kept meals on the table when paychecks were thin. Food companies selling canned meats had no desire to publicize such recipes, but families relied on them nonetheless. Peanut butter meatballs revealed the quiet ingenuity of blending pantry staples into meals that worked. They were survival turned into creativity, proof that even odd combinations could bring comfort and satisfaction when shared across the family table. Making salad dressing in a washed-out ketchup bottle might sound like a stretch, but to a 1950s housewife, it was second nature. Once the bottle was empty, she would rinse it with hot water, add oil, vinegar, mustard, salt, sugar, and whatever herbs she had on hand. Then she would shake it up. No blender, no mess, just good old-fashioned elbow grease. That ketchup bottle became a reliable dressing shaker, ready whenever needed. It poured easily, stored well in the fridge, and cost nothing extra. You did not need to buy fancy bottles or mixers. You already had what you needed. It was clever, resourceful, and oddly satisfying. This trick came from the same spirit that saved string in a jar or foil in a drawer. Waste nothing. Use everything. Even if the bottle was glass, it still did its job. Housewives loved having control over their ingredients, especially with young kids at the table. No artificial flavors, just what they made themselves. Today we chase clean eating and low-waste trends. But back then, those ideas just meant doing things the smart way. And sometimes that meant turning trash into treasure with nothing more than a good shake. Gravy powder from pan scrapings was the kind of invention that came from hunger and a good sense of timing. After roasting or frying, the browned bits at the bottom of the pan were never wasted. They were scraped, dried slowly in the oven or near the stove, and then ground into a coarse powder that could last for weeks. A spoonful stirred into hot water gave you instant gravy, no bouillon cubes, no jars, no packets. It tasted real because it was. That powder held the memory of every meal it came from: roast chicken, seared chops, bacon ends. Some cooks even mixed it with flour and lard to make little gravy starter balls, ready to go at a moment's notice. The flavor was deep, smoky, and hard to pin down because it came from life, not a label. Today, we throw those scrapings away. We clean pans too quickly. But back then, this was the best part. It turned yesterday's effort into tomorrow's comfort. Baked rice and onion casserole was simple, plain, and deeply dependable. In the hardest years of the 1930s, families needed meals that filled the belly without emptying the pantry, and this one checked every box. You started with raw rice, mixed it with chopped onions and whatever fat you had, bacon grease, lard, even a dab of margarine. Sometimes a splash of milk or broth went in for moisture, but often it was just water and a bit of salt. The whole thing was baked slowly in the oven until the rice swelled, the onions softened, and the top formed a thin, crisp crust. It smelled like comfort and tasted like survival. There was nothing fancy in it, but that was the point. It worked. You could serve it hot for dinner or eat the leftovers cold for breakfast. Some added beans, others stirred in eggs to bulk it up. But even in its bare form, it felt like a full meal. It was the kind of dish that disappeared fast because it was familiar, filling, and just warm enough to carry you through. Using scissors to cut herbs and bacon was one of those simple tricks that just made sense. Before food processors and fancy slicers, housewives relied on kitchen shears for the small stuff. A quick snip of chives over a salad, a rough cut of parsley into a soup, or even slicing bacon into strips before it hit the pan. It was all faster with scissors. You did it right over the dish, with no cutting board to clean. Less mess, more control. It felt precise and easy, especially when time was tight. The same shears used to open packages or trim butcher paper were rinsed and put right to work. They were sturdy, reliable, and always within reach. This trick was not flashy, but it saved minutes when minutes mattered. Even kids could learn to use them safely under watchful eyes. And while modern kitchens come with gadgets for everything, sometimes all you need is a good pair of scissors and a steady hand. Evaporated milk whipped cream was the sort of dessert trick passed between neighbors, not down through cookbooks. When cream was too expensive or just plain missing from the fridge, you reached for that dented can of evaporated milk in the back of the cupboard. You chilled it until it was ice cold, sometimes freezing it for 10 minutes, and then beat it with a whisk or mixer until it fluffed up. If you added a little sugar and a drop of vanilla, you almost could not tell the difference. It would not hold shape as long as the real thing, but it made a bowl of canned peaches or gelatin salad feel like a special treat. Children did not care if it came from a cow or a can. If it looked creamy, that was enough. You could even fold it into puddings or layer it in trifles. The trick was to keep everything cold and to know when to stop mixing. Today's cookbooks skip this entirely. They assume everyone has heavy cream or will just buy whipped topping. But the old way worked just fine, and it felt like magic every time it turned out right. Fried cornmeal mush cakes were born from the same pot twice. You would make cornmeal mush, just cornmeal, water, maybe a pinch of salt, let it set in a pan overnight, and slice it into firm pieces the next day. Then you fried those slices in grease until the edges crisped up like polenta. It was crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, and just enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something indulgent. Back in the 1930s, this was how you stretched a single meal into two. The mush might have been dinner one night and breakfast the next morning. Some people served it with syrup or molasses, while others went savory and added onions or lard. There was no right or wrong. It was all about using what was left. You did not throw anything out, especially not a whole pot of cooled mush. It became a habit, a ritual, even a comfort. Children would dunk the crispy slices in milk or eat them straight from the pan. It was Depression-era cooking at its most honest. Plain ingredients, repurposed with care, turned into something worth looking forward to. Peanut butter and meatloaf might sound like a dare, but in the mid-century kitchen, it was just another thrifty trick. Ground beef was expensive, especially when you were trying to feed more mouths than you had meat. So home cooks started mixing in all sorts of things to bulk it up. Breadcrumbs, oats, mashed beans, and yes, peanut butter. A few spoonfuls of peanut butter made the mixture stickier and easier to mold, added a little fat for moisture, and brought a nutty depth that some people genuinely came to love. The flavor was subtle, not overpowering, and often paired with ketchup or tomato sauce on top to balance it out. You would find this idea popping up in wartime rationing cookbooks and community recipe swaps, usually in the margins with little notes like "kids did not notice" or "husband approved." It was especially popular in places where peanuts were cheap and beef was not. These meatloaves were humble, hearty, and surprisingly flavorful, and when baked right, they held together beautifully. The next time you are low on ingredients and high on curiosity, try it. You might understand why people kept doing it even after the war ended. Gelatin whipped desserts were one of those clever inventions that took something simple and made it feel like a treat you could be proud to serve at a church potluck. By folding whipped evaporated milk into gelatin, church ladies transformed a basic box of flavored powder into something airy and mousse-like. It was light, colorful, and just sweet enough to feel like dessert without being too heavy. This trick was especially popular because evaporated milk was cheaper and lasted longer on pantry shelves than cream. It was also easier to find during times when fresh dairy was not always available. Families loved how the mixture set into a fluffy texture that felt luxurious, even though it was made from very humble ingredients. At socials, these dishes often arrived in bright pastel shades that lit up the serving table. Kids thought they were getting a fancy pudding, while adults appreciated how economical the recipe was. It was the kind of clever little trick that stretched ingredients and made people smile. The fact that it took almost no time to prepare only added to its appeal. Looking back, it was not just dessert, but a symbol of creativity in community kitchens. Canned shrimp cocktails were the faux fancy starters that added a surprising sparkle of elegance to otherwise thrifty dinners. 70s housewives would chill small canned shrimp, portion them into neat little glass cups, and then ladle over a simple sauce of ketchup stirred with horseradish. It was bold to call it cocktail sauce, but presentation made all the difference, because to guests, it looked like something lifted straight from a restaurant menu. The truth was far humbler, since the ingredients were all inexpensive and easy to keep stocked in the pantry. Families felt indulged by the sight of those little cups. Children thought it was adventurous and exotic, and hosts could entertain guests without straining their budgets. What mattered most was not the origin of the shrimp, but the impression of sophistication that came with it. This dish embodied the 70s love of thrift, dressed up as flair, where appearances counted for more than cost. It was practical, impressive, and memorable, which made it a go-to recipe for countless households. Even today, many people recall the taste with nostalgia because it turned otherwise ordinary evenings into small celebrations that felt a little bit glamorous without the restaurant bill. Layering newspaper in the icebox was another way grandfathers made cooling more effective before plastics and modern insulation. Sheets of newspaper were placed around blocks of ice, slowing the rate of melting and keeping temperatures steadier inside the box. The paper also absorbed drips as the ice thawed, making cleanup easier for the household. This trick stretched the usefulness of every delivery of ice, which was vital when budgets were thin and deliveries were not always dependable. Milk, butter, vegetables, and leftovers stayed fresh longer because of something as simple as yesterday's newsprint. Families learned to line shelves, cover containers, and wrap items with newspaper, adding an extra layer of insulation and protection. It was a clever, no-cost solution that every household practiced without thinking twice because it simply worked. Children often remembered digging through the icebox, noticing the soft crinkle of paper under dishes, a sound tied to memory as much as smell or taste. Though the method faded with the arrival of modern refrigerators, it symbolized the ingenuity of an era. Newspaper kept the cold in and the waste out, proving even scraps had hidden value worth remembering. Turning leftover oatmeal into muffins was a quiet revolution in the breakfast routine. Cold, sticky oatmeal from the morning pot often sat lonely on the stove. But 1950s housewives had no intention of throwing it out. Instead, they folded it into muffin batter with flour, sugar, eggs, and whatever fruit or spices were on hand. The result was moist, dense muffins that filled the kitchen with warmth. You could add raisins, apples, cinnamon, even nuts if you had some. No one at the table guessed it was yesterday's porridge. It became a treat, not a chore. And it stretched one meal into another with hardly any effort. The texture was satisfying, the flavor comforting, and the savings unspoken but deeply felt. Frugality met creativity here. Housewives did not just save food, they remade it. These muffins were humble but reliable. They showed up in lunchboxes, picnic baskets, and church bake sales. And each one carried the quiet message that nothing in this house gets wasted, not even cold oatmeal. Ketchup meat marinades were the unsung heroes of tough cuts. If the meat was chewy or on the edge of spoiling, ketchup was your best bet. Mixed with vinegar, onions, and sometimes a bit of sugar, it created a tangy brine that broke down fibers and gave the meat a richer taste. The acidity worked like magic, especially overnight in the icebox, or even just an hour before cooking. Frying or grilling after a ketchup soak gave the meat a caramelized crust and a deep savory flavor that covered up any flaws. It was a go-to for cheap steaks, pork scraps, and even liver. Some families added garlic or mustard, others kept it plain. Either way, it was dependable. You will not find this trick in high-end recipes or modern cookbooks, but it worked so well that it stayed in rotation for decades. Ketchup was more than a condiment. It was a tool, and for a lot of families, it turned subpar meat into something you actually looked forward to. Pickled beet eggs looked almost too strange to eat, but they were one of the smartest ways to stretch a protein that was hard to come by. Eggs were precious, and when you had a few on hand, preserving them meant you could enjoy them over days instead of one single meal. The trick was in the brine. You took leftover beet juice, usually from canned or boiled beets, added vinegar and some spices, and dropped peeled boiled eggs into the jar. After a few days, they turned bright pink and took on a tangy, earthy flavor that was far more interesting than a plain boiled egg. The color made them feel like a treat, especially to children who had not seen anything festive in months. These were served at room temperature, sometimes sliced onto bread or mashed into sandwiches. They could last for over a week in a cool place, which made them ideal for families without ice boxes. They were flavorful, pretty to look at, and most importantly, long-lasting. Pickled beet eggs were one of those strange depression dishes that did not just make do, but made something new. Gelatin mold leftover savor might sound like a punishment today, but back then it was a point of pride. Once gelatin became affordable and easy to prepare, people found all kinds of ways to use it, especially as a vessel to stretch meals and make use of leftovers. You had a little ham, some canned peas, a scoop of last night's macaroni salad. Mix it all into lemon or tomato gelatin and pour it into a mold. Chill, unmold, and suddenly you had a centerpiece. It was cold. It was colorful. It was the future, or so they said. These savory gelatin molds were featured everywhere from homemaker magazines to government-sponsored nutrition guides. They promised frugality, beauty, and innovation all in one jiggly dish. Housewives with limited means could make a full meal look polished and party-ready. People even had specific molds for specific meals. Rings, domes, fish shapes, you name it. It may not have always tasted great, but it looked impressive. And that counted for something. Somewhere between waste, not, and show-off, gelatin found its niche. Orange sherbet layered parfaits were the kind of dessert that looked fancier than they really were, which was exactly the point. Church ladies had a way of turning inexpensive sherbet into something that felt like a treat from a restaurant. Layered in tall glasses with whipped cream or fruit, they were colorful and refreshing. The bright orange against white cream made them eye-catching on tables lined with potluck desserts. Sherbet was cheap and kept well in the freezer, making it a practical ingredient for families on tight budgets. By layering it with simple pantry items, women created parfaits that kids loved and adults admired. The trick was all in the presentation because the flavors were simple, but the look was memorable. Parfaits like these were a favorite in summer when something cold and light was most welcome. At gatherings, trays of parfaits could be carried in and set down with pride. They proved that even with limited resources, you could bring joy and elegance to a table. They were clever, thrifty, and full of charm, just like the women who made them. Bologna salad spread was the unsung hero of thrifty sandwiches in the 70s. Housewives would grind leftover bologna, mix it with mayonnaise and pickle relish, and spread it onto white bread for an inexpensive lunch that tasted indulgent. It stretched meat further than slices ever could, making one package last several days. Children thought it was a treat, especially when tucked into lunchboxes with potato chips or carrot sticks. The spread had a tangy bite that felt different from plain lunch meat, and it became a signature flavor for many families. It was fast to prepare, easy to store, and endlessly adaptable, with some adding chopped onions or mustard for variety. In an era when waste was frowned upon, turning scraps into something craveable showed real ingenuity. Housewives understood that presentation mattered, and when cut into triangles or paired with crackers, this humble spread felt surprisingly polished. It was proof that resourcefulness could feed both bellies and pride without breaking the budget. Pickled okra was one of those clever preserving tricks that kept garden bounty on the table long after summer ended. Church ladies would fill jars with okra pods, vinegar, garlic, and spices, sealing them up to store for the months ahead. The brine softened the vegetable just enough while keeping its crunch, creating a tangy, flavorful side that paired well with heavy meals. At potlucks, a jar of pickled okra could cut through the richness of casseroles and meats, adding variety and brightness. Families who grew okra in backyard gardens relied on this method to prevent waste, turning surplus harvests into something special. It was also a clever way to bring color and texture to cold weather meals when fresh vegetables were harder to find. The jars themselves lined pantry shelves like jewels, each one a testament to planning and thrift. Pickled okra was more than food. It was a sign of care, ensuring nothing went to waste and every meal had balance. Celery salt on cottage cheese might not sound like much, but for mid-century dieters, it was a little miracle. In the 1950s, cottage cheese was hailed as the queen of health foods, low in fat, high in protein, and endlessly adaptable. But let us be honest, it was bland. Enter celery salt. Just a dash gave it a briny, herby kick that made the whole bowl come alive. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and sprinkled on everything from tomato slices to hard-boiled eggs. But with cottage cheese, it had a real glow-up. This combo became a go-to lunch for housewives watching their waistlines, often served on lettuce with half a pear or a canned peach on top. It looked like a diet plate, but tasted like something more satisfying. You could find this suggestion in health columns, diet booklets, and women's magazines from coast to coast. It was a trick born of scarcity and self-restraint, dressed up to feel like something fancier. Even today, a bite of cottage cheese with a little celery salt feels like stepping into a lunch counter from 70 years ago. Quiet, cool, and just a little strange. Sweet potato pie without eggs was a testament to how much flavor could be pulled from so little. Eggs were expensive, milk was scarce, and sugar had to be stretched, but sweet potatoes were dependable. You could bake them, mash them, and mix them with a bit of flour, spices, and molasses to create a smooth filling that held together without help. The crust was optional, and in many homes it was skipped entirely to save flour and fat. The pie was poured into a greased tin and baked until it firmed at the edges and browned just slightly on top. It was soft, earthy, and just sweet enough to count as dessert. Sometimes people would add a dab of butter or a splash of vinegar to deepen the flavor. You did not need whipped cream or toppings. This was comfort on its own. It tasted like autumn, like Sunday dinner, like something you made from scratch and with care. Sweet potato pie was not about presentation. It was about getting a little joy out of the root vegetables you had on hand. And back then, that joy meant everything. Split biscuit griddle reheat was how you made yesterday's biscuits feel like today's blessing. You took cold, slightly stale biscuits from the day before, split them open, and fried the cut sides in bacon grease or lard. The crust got crispy, the inside stayed soft, and what was once boring became suddenly hard to resist. It was quick, easy, and made the whole kitchen smell like breakfast, even if it was just leftovers. You did not need to add anything, but sometimes a dab of jam or honey made it extra special. Some folks even layered a slice of ham or fried egg between the halves for a quick sandwich, especially when mornings were rushed and food was scarce. In households where waste was not an option, this trick kept bread from the trash and put something warm on the plate. It also stretched a single batch of biscuits across more meals, more bellies, and more days. No recipe needed, just memory and muscle. Today, you will not find this move in a cooking app, but for the cooks who lived through lean times, it was just how things were done. Canned fruit cocktail as a dessert base was the sweet secret at the end of many 1950s meals. With real fruit hard to keep fresh and budget stretched thin, those little syrupy cans were a godsend. Cherries, pears, peaches, grapes, all diced and ready to pour. Housewives would layer the fruit with whipped cream, gelatin, or cottage cheese to create something that looked fancy and felt indulgent. It was easy, fast, and colorful. Kids loved it, husbands asked for seconds, and guests never complained. These desserts came together with minimal effort but plenty of flair. You might call it ambrosia, fluff, or just fruit salad, but it was more than the sum of its parts. A few spoonfuls brought color to a beige dinner and comfort to tired families. These cans lined pantry shelves like promise in a tin. Whether topped with shredded coconut, marshmallows, or a dollop of cream, the cocktail did its job well. And it did so with the kind of quiet reliability that defined homemaking in the 1950s. Salt rub for crispy chicken skin was the kind of trick that worked better than it had any right to. You rubbed coarse salt into the skin of a whole chicken, thighs, breasts, wings, everything, then let it rest overnight in the icebox uncovered. The salt drew out moisture, tightened the skin, and left it primed to blister and crackle in the oven the next day. No need for basting or fancy glaze, just dry heat and a little patience. When it roasted, the skin puffed and crisped like potato chips, golden and full of flavor. Underneath, the meat stayed juicy. Some cooks even added a bit of ground pepper or paprika to the salt rub for a touch of color and spice. That contrast, crispy on the outside, tender inside, was what people remembered most. This dry brining method was passed from one cook to the next without much fuss because it just worked. Modern cookbooks talk about air chilling or convection fans, but back then it was salt and time. And it never failed to earn a seat at the Sunday dinner table. Cabbage water broth might not sound like much, but in the 1930s it was enough to keep people going. Boiling cabbage was already a regular routine, but families quickly learned to never pour the water down the drain. That cloudy, sulfur-scented liquid held nutrients, starch, and just enough flavor to turn into a soup base. Some would throw in a diced potato, a handful of onion skins, or a bit of old bread to thicken it. Others might add salt, if they had any, and call it a night. There was a kind of pride in making something from what others saw as nothing. It might not have tasted like much, but it was hot, filling, and warm on cold days when spirits were thin. In some houses, that broth became the start of a stew that would stretch out over days. You reused everything back then, especially the things no one thought to save. Even the cabbage leaves, once cooked soft and pale, might be mashed and eaten with a splash of vinegar. But the broth was the heart of it. It told a story of making do with what you had, even if it was only boiled water and scraps. It was soup born of hardship and resilience. Coffee can bread baking was born out of pure practicality, but it somehow felt a little magical too. If you had a clean, empty can, anywhere from an old coffee tin to a leftover fruit cocktail can, you had yourself a bread pan. These cans were used for everything from banana bread to steamed Boston brown bread, and they gave each loaf that tall, round look you could not get from a standard pan. The inside of the can would be greased with bacon fat or butter, filled partway with dough, and then either baked or steamed depending on the recipe. The end result was a soft, rich bread with a golden crust and a shape that stood proud on the plate. Some cans were even reused again and again, passed down like family heirlooms, with their dents and scratches telling their own story. And when the bread came out, kids always thought it looked a little like cake. So of course it disappeared in minutes. Old cookbooks called these canned loaves or pantry tins, and for good reason. You made do with what you had, and the results were better than expected. Coffee cans made perfect pans, and no one thought twice about it. Crisping cracklings for cornbread was a favorite move in kitchens where nothing was wasted. When pork was rendered for fat, the crunchy bits left behind were saved as cracklings. Grandfathers stirred these into cornbread batter before baking, adding texture, flavor, and protein. The result was a golden pan of cornbread with crisp surprises in every bite. It was filling, nutritious, and kept families satisfied when meat was scarce. Crackling cornbread became more than food. It was a memory of gatherings around the table, where every slice carried the taste of thrift and ingenuity. This simple addition turned a humble bread into a complete meal. Served with beans or greens, it could keep a family full for hours. The practice showed how every part of an animal was valued, down to the last crunchy morsel. Today, the idea seems unusual, but back then, cracklings in cornbread were a sign of clever cooking and smart living. Waffle iron hash browns were the answer to crispy potatoes without the mess of frying. Shredded potatoes pressed into the iron crisped on both sides at once, freeing housewives from standing over a skillet with popping grease. It was neat, quick, and just inventive enough to feel like a brand new dish. The trick spread quickly through kitchens and community cookbooks, turning a breakfast staple into a gadget-driven shortcut. Kids loved the crisp edges, husbands appreciated the speed, and wives loved that the cleanup was minimal. It gave old waffle irons new life beyond breakfast, which was a welcome bit of resourcefulness. The result was golden, crunchy potatoes that looked just as appetizing as fried ones, but with far less fuss. A housewife in the 70s might not have had time for extra steps, but she had plenty of cleverness to spare. The waffle iron proved that appliances could double as problem solvers when you needed them most. Leftover rice pudding was one of the sweetest ways to disguise yesterday's dinner into today's dessert. Housewives baked cold rice with milk, sugar, raisins, and a shake of cinnamon until it came out warm and fragrant, filling kitchens with comfort. It was the definition of resourcefulness, transforming something bland and unwanted into a dish that families looked forward to. The chewy raisins plumped in the milk, the cinnamon gave it a cozy spice, and suddenly, leftover rice felt intentional. This recipe stretched grocery budgets by ensuring no cooked grain ever went to waste, and it became a tradition in many homes. Children often requested it, not realizing they were eating the previous night's supper in disguise. Housewives treasured recipes like these because they brought joy without expense. Rice pudding was frugal, filling, and forgiving, adapting to whatever was on hand. It turned a basic staple into something sweet enough to remember fondly decades later. Refrigerator pickling with vinegar and sugar was how housewives brought a little brightness into their meals without a full day of canning. You sliced cucumbers, onions, or even green beans, poured over a hot mix of vinegar, sugar, and spices, then sealed the jar and let it chill. No boiling water baths, no pressure cookers, just patience and a fridge shelf. In a day or two, you had sweet, tangy pickles that added snap and flavor to otherwise plain meals. They stayed crisp, looked colorful, and made sandwiches or roasts feel like something special. Best of all, it gave you control. You adjusted the sweetness, spiced it your way, and worked with whatever was in season. Refrigerator pickling felt homemade, but also modern. It was fast enough for weeknight dinners, but classic enough to impress guests. This trick helped housewives stay ahead, turning garden extras or produce drawer stragglers into little jars of joy. In a world where nothing was wasted, pickling meant preservation, not just taste. And every time you opened the fridge to that tangy scent, it felt like a little reward for doing things the smart way. Lima bean stew was one of those one-pot miracles that got families through the leanest stretches of the 1930s. Dried lima beans were cheap, easy to store, and when soaked and cooked slowly, they turned creamy and rich. Families would simmer them all day with scraps of carrot, onion, or potato, whatever they could find. If they had bacon grease or lard, a spoonful added body. If not, salt and thyme would do the job. There was no recipe, just instinct and adaptation. Sometimes the beans were mashed into a thick paste, sometimes left whole and floating in broth. The stew could stretch over 2 or even 3 days, especially if you kept adding water or leftover vegetables. Kids might complain, but mothers knew. This pot was the difference between full and hungry. In many homes, the smell of beans bubbling away was a kind of comfort. It meant there would be something to eat tonight. It was frugal food with just enough warmth to feel like dinner. In hard times, lima bean stew taught you patience, resourcefulness, and the power of cooking what you had, not what you wished for. Leftover ham bone soup was a trick that proved nothing in the kitchen ever had to go to waste. Church ladies could take a single leftover ham bone, one that most people might have tossed, and turn it into a pot that could feed an entire family. By simmering the bone for hours, every bit of flavor and richness was drawn into the broth. Beans, lentils, or whatever garden vegetables were available would be added to bulk it up. This not only stretched the ham to its absolute limit, but also made the soup filling and nourishing. Children might not have realized that what they were eating came from scraps, because it always smelled and tasted like a meal prepared with intention. At church suppers, this kind of dish meant one family's leftovers could become another family's shared meal. Ham bone soup often tasted even better the next day, which meant it carried households through more than one dinner. It showed the quiet wisdom of thrift that church ladies held dear. Nothing was wasted, and everything was put toward filling plates. It was a humble recipe that embodied both economy and generosity. Cooking fish on wooden planks was an old outdoor trick that gave ordinary meals extraordinary flavor. Grandfathers would place fillets on soaked planks of cedar or oak, then set them near fire or coals. The wood steamed and smoked, infusing the fish with a rich aroma while keeping it moist. This method required no fancy pans or seasonings, just wood and patience. The result was a meal that tasted both rustic and refined, perfect for family gatherings or camp suppers. It was also practical, since the fish did not stick to pans and cleanup was easy. The technique carried a sense of tradition, passed down from native practices and embraced by homesteaders. Sharing fish cooked this way was a memorable experience, blending nature, flavor, and simplicity. Even when money was scarce, this trick made a humble catch taste like a feast. It was proof that clever cooking did not depend on gadgets, but on timeless knowledge. Cabbage soup diet trick was less about flavor and more about following trends. In the 70s, the idea of slimming meals took hold, and housewives leaned on cabbage soup as a quick fix. It was cheap, filling, and gave the illusion of progress when paired with diet plans of the day. Whole heads of cabbage simmered with onions, tomatoes, and broth became the base for a week of meals. While it was never glamorous, it fit the moment, when weight-conscious recipes filled magazines and cookbooks. Housewives shared variations among friends, sometimes dressing it up with spices or lean meats, but the essence was always thrift wrapped in health claims. It was one of those fads that reflected both resourcefulness and cultural pressure, standing as proof that even soups carried social weight. Casseroles with crushed potato chips on top might sound indulgent, but they were really a thrifty invention of clever 1960s moms. Instead of throwing away the crumbs at the bottom of a snack bag, they sprinkled them over casseroles as a crunchy topping. The chips added flavor, texture, and a golden crust that made even the simplest casserole feel exciting. Popular with tuna, chicken, or vegetable bases, the crunchy topping transformed leftovers and pantry staples into something families looked forward to. It was also a way of stretching expensive ingredients by making casseroles the star of the meal rather than a side dish. The trick appealed to kids who loved the fun of finding chips baked into dinner and reassured parents who wanted nothing to go to waste. The casserole itself became a canvas for creativity, but it was the potato chip topping that made it memorable. Moms of the 1960s proved that even the last crumbs from a snack bag could turn a basic family meal into comfort food with a touch of flair. Orange Julius copycats were the mall treat that made its way into every thrifty household blender. Housewives learned that a can of frozen orange juice concentrate, blended with milk, sugar, and sometimes a splash of vanilla, created the same frothy drink without the trip downtown. Children begged for them after school, husbands enjoyed them on hot afternoons, and neighbors saw them as proof that homemakers could replicate anything. The mixture was creamy, sweet, and refreshing, a little luxury that cost only pennies per serving. It was thick enough to pass for indulgent, but still light enough to feel wholesome, which fit perfectly with the health-conscious trends of the decade. Housewives clipped variations of the recipe from magazines and passed them around at church gatherings, each one swearing hers tasted just like the real thing. The magic was not just in the flavor, but in the feeling of beating the system, of making store-bought luxury at home. Sun tea in glass jars was the definition of resourcefulness because it took nothing more than water, tea bags, and the sun to create a refreshing drink that could serve a whole gathering. Church ladies knew that setting a large glass jar out on the porch or window ledge was the easiest way to brew tea without having to boil a kettle for hours. The slow steeping in sunlight gave the tea a smoother flavor that people swore was better than stovetop brewing. It was also free, which meant it did not add strain to household budgets. Once brewed, it was poured into pitchers, sweetened to taste, and served over ice at socials and dinners. Many ladies flavored it with fresh lemon slices or sprigs of mint, turning it into something special without extra cost. On hot days, a jug of sun tea sitting on a table was as much a part of church events as hymnals and folding chairs. Neighbors loved how they could brew large amounts without lifting more than a jar. It was a simple practice, but it carried with it the spirit of sharing and ease. Sun tea was refreshing, communal, and quietly ingenious. Homemade root beer in stone jugs was a tradition that blended fun, flavor, and ingenuity. Using sassafras roots, sugar water, and yeast, grandfathers would brew their own bubbly drinks at home. The mixture fermented just enough to create carbonation, making it fizzy and refreshing without being strong. Families often kept jugs tucked away in cool spots, waiting days until the drink was ready. It was a treat for children and adults alike, especially during warm summers when store-bought sodas were too costly or unavailable. Brewing root beer turned kitchens into little workshops of science and patience. The smell of sassafras filled the air, and the sound of corks popping was part of the excitement. It connected people to the land and to old traditions, since sassafras was foraged or traded. Sharing a glass was about more than taste, it was about celebrating something made with your own hands. It was one of those clever traditions that brought joy without spending much. Vinegar pie filling thickener was one of those odd tricks that worked better than it had any right to. Older fruit pies often came out runny, too sweet, or flat. A splash of vinegar helped in two ways. First, it cut the sugary taste and brought the fruit's brightness back. Second, it helped the flour or starch bind the filling together. Some even said it helped fruit hold its shape. You saw this most in old apple or berry pies, where just a teaspoon gave the flavor a sharp little kick. It was not something most people noticed, but if it was missing, you could tell. The sharp smell faded in the oven, leaving behind something more balanced. A clean slice, no leaks. Some tricks are bold. This one just did its job, and did it well. Plain boiled wheat berries were a dish that reminded people just how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Wheat berries are whole, unprocessed kernels of wheat that take a long time to cook and an even longer time to chew. But during the Depression, they were affordable, full of fiber, and could be bought in bulk. Families would boil them for hours, softening them just enough to be spooned into bowls like porridge. Sometimes a bit of salt or molasses was added, but most of the time it was just grain and water. The texture was dense, almost nutty, and the feeling of fullness lasted longer than most other meals. It was common on farms and in rural communities where wheat was grown or traded directly. The simplicity of it made it reliable, and when paired with a piece of bread or a spoonful of jam, it could pass as breakfast or dinner. Some families toasted leftover wheat berries to reuse in stews or baked them into loaves. No part of the grain was wasted, and no meal was taken for granted. This was not food for pleasure. It was food for survival. Bread-soaked meatballs were a small act of genius hiding in plain sight. When you did not have enough breadcrumbs, or when the bread itself was too stale to eat, you soaked it in milk until it turned soft and fluffy. Then you mixed it into ground meat, herbs, and maybe an egg if you had one. The result? A tender, juicy meatball that held its shape without drying out. This trick also stretched your meat further, letting 1 pound do the work of 2. It came from Italian kitchens, but American homes embraced it fast. Sunday dinners, church potlucks, and penny-pinching mothers all used it. And it was not just for meatballs. You would see the same method in meatloaf and stuffed peppers too. The soaked bread kept things moist without adding weight. Modern recipes may call for panko or fancy crumbs, But this old trick still beats them all when it comes to comfort and thrift. Leftover mashed potatoes turned into pancakes was a breakfast staple for families who refused to waste a single spoonful. The process was simple. You took cold, firm mashed potatoes, added a bit of flour or egg, and dropped the mixture into a hot skillet. Crisp on the outside, soft on the inside. It was comforting, filling, and downright thrifty. Housewives in the 1950s knew better than to toss leftovers. Potatoes were cheap, yes, but not so cheap you could afford to throw them out. These pancakes stretched a single dish across meals and added warmth to the morning. You could dress them up with chopped onions, garlic, or even leftover bits of cheese. Fried in bacon grease or butter, they gave off the kind of smell that made a kitchen feel alive. Kids loved them, husbands praised them, and moms appreciated the ease. Leftover night did not always mean boring. It meant clever. It meant knowing how to make something new out of what had already served its purpose. These potato pancakes did not just fill bellies, they proved that a little imagination could go a long, long way. Instant pudding frosting was nothing short of a revelation for busy 70s housewives who wanted cakes that looked polished without hours of work. The method was simple yet ingenious. Dry pudding mix was whipped into cold milk and then lightened with whipped topping, creating a frosting that was airy, fluffy, and indulgent. Unlike traditional buttercream, which required skill and time, this shortcut came together in minutes, making it a reliable choice for birthdays, school bake sales, or last-minute desserts. Cakes that might have seemed plain or store-bought suddenly looked bakery fresh, topped with soft peaks of sweet and creamy frosting that children absolutely adored. It was inexpensive, easy to store, and required only a handful of pantry staples, which made it especially appealing during years when budgets were tight. Housewives loved it not only because it tasted good, but because it freed up time for everything else that demanded attention at home. The frosting held its shape, lasted well in the refrigerator, and gave cakes a colorful, festive finish when tinted with food coloring. It was proof that clever kitchen tricks often outshone complicated recipes. In the end, instant pudding frosting was remembered as both thrifty and delightful, a true staple of 70s celebrations. Rolled jam pinwheels were a sweet answer to leftover pie dough, making sure no scrap went unused in church kitchens. Instead of tossing out the extra trimmings, women rolled the dough flat, spread it with jam or jelly, sprinkled a little sugar, and baked it into spiraled cookies. The result was crisp on the outside, gooey in the center, and irresistible to anyone nearby. These little pinwheels often became a reward for children hovering around the kitchen, eager for something warm. At church events, trays of them were passed around alongside coffee, proving that even scraps could become a memorable treat. They carried with them the lesson that nothing in the kitchen should be wasted, no matter how small. Each batch was different depending on the flavor of jam on hand, which gave them a charming variety. Rolled jam pinwheels were thrift, tradition, and comfort rolled into one, a little bite of sweetness that showed off everyday cleverness. Leftover cereal meat coating was a trick that came straight from the back of the box. When breadcrumbs were out and cornflakes had already gone into yesterday's casserole, cooks got creative with whatever dry cereal they had left. Bran flakes, crisped rice, even plain puffed wheat. They were all crushed, seasoned, and pressed into service as a meat coating. The idea was to roll a cutlet or drumstick in milk or egg, then dredge it through crushed cereal to make a crunchy crust. It was cheaper, often healthier, and surprisingly effective. Some people added parmesan or paprika to the mix to boost the flavor, while others liked the sweetness it brought to pork or chicken. Kids never questioned it, especially if the cereal had been part of breakfast just that morning. These tricks were passed down in hand-me-down cookbooks and on recipe cards that started with, "Use what you have." And that is really what it was about, making dinner work without running to the store. Sometimes the best recipes came from the bottom of the box. Zwieback toast was the kind of food that got made, stored, and reused until there was nothing left but crumbs. Originally a German recipe, Zwieback is twice-baked bread, meaning it is baked once, sliced, and then dried out in the oven until crisp. During the 1930s, it became a go-to staple for households trying to stretch bread that was starting to go stale. The result was crunchy, dry, and perfect for storing without refrigeration. It could be softened with warm milk and sugar for children or crumbled into puddings and meatloaf fillers to bulk out recipes. Some families even soaked it in broth or fruit juice for dessert-like treats. When biscuits were gone and crackers were out of reach, Zwieback toast filled the gap. It had a mild flavor and could go sweet or savory, depending on what you added. People loved it for its reliability. It would not mold, spoil, or turn on you. You could keep it in a tin for weeks and still count on it to do its job. For babies and the elderly, it was soaked soft. For everyone else, it was just one more way to stretch bread far past its shelf life. Condensed soup as a sauce base was the shortcut that felt anything but lazy. Cream of mushroom, tomato, chicken, it all came in cans stacked high in the pantry. Housewives relied on them to turn plain casseroles into creamy, hearty meals with just one stir. Instead of making bechamel from scratch, you opened a can and added milk or broth. Suddenly, you had a thick, smooth sauce that tasted homemade. It was fast, affordable, and tasted good with nearly everything: pasta, rice, meat, or vegetables. One can could coat an entire dish. And when you were feeding 5 people on a 2-meal budget, that mattered. It helped bring consistency to meals and gave new life to leftovers. You could even mix 2 flavors to make your own twist. It was a blank canvas that worked with whatever was in the fridge. That kind of flexibility was gold in a 1950s kitchen. These soups may have started as shelf-stable convenience food, but they became a trusted tool in every cook's kit. Housewives did not just use them, they elevated them. And that was the trick all along. Bacon grease jar cooking was not just a habit, it was a household rule. You never threw out bacon fat, not once. It was poured hot into a tin can or a glass jar, usually kept by the stove, and reused for just about everything. Fried potatoes, sautéed greens, biscuits brushed on top for that golden shine. Some families even swore by it for making popcorn. It added flavor where there was none and stretched what little fat you had across the whole week. Bacon grease turned bland cabbage into something rich and smoky. It revived day-old cornbread and crisped up onions like nothing else. The jar was never labeled, and no one needed it to be. You just knew what it was by the smell. Today, we are told to throw away fat and use olive oil instead. But back then, this was gold. It was seasoning, substance, and thrift all in one. And even though it is missing from most cookbooks now, that old bacon jar still lives on in a few quiet kitchens that remember its worth. Ketchup sandwiches were not a joke back then. They were survival. 2 slices of white bread, a squeeze of ketchup, and that was lunch. When fresh tomatoes were too expensive or gone altogether, the bottle stood in. It was cheap, it was sweet, and it gave just enough tang to fool your brain into thinking you had a real sandwich. Sometimes people would add onions or pickles if they had them, but most of the time it was just the red stuff and bread. And you would be surprised how many kids looked forward to it. It was bright, flavorful, and in a decade where most meals were beige, that mattered more than you would think. Ketchup was a staple condiment because it had a long shelf life and could cover the taste of anything going off. In this case, it became the main event. Parents handed it out with a smile, even if their hearts sank doing it. It was food, and that counted. You might laugh at it today, but in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches were a reminder that even when the pantry was bare, you could still pretend to eat like everyone else. Applesauce as an oil substitute was one of the smartest baking swaps passed down by church ladies, and it still works today. When oil was too expensive or hard to find, women stirred applesauce into cakes, muffins, or quick breads. The result was a moist crumb and a light sweetness that made every slice taste richer. It was a brilliant solution because apples were plentiful and easy to preserve in jars. Families with apple trees especially relied on this trick, turning harvests into year-round supplies for baking. The swap not only stretched ingredients, but also made recipes feel healthier at a time when nutrition was on everyone's mind. Cakes made this way often carried a subtle fruitiness that made them stand out from heavier versions. Bake sales and potlucks saw many applesauce cakes, their recipes proudly shared between friends. This clever trick also meant that a family could enjoy dessert even when oil rations were low. It was resourcefulness at its best, proving that flavor and thrift could live hand in hand. With each slice, people tasted both ingenuity and comfort, a perfect reflection of church kitchen wisdom. Macaroni salad with Miracle Whip was the bright, tangy dish that seemed to appear at nearly every picnic, potluck, and backyard gathering throughout the 70s. Housewives would boil up generous pots of elbow macaroni, drain them, and then fold the cooled noodles into Miracle Whip instead of traditional mayonnaise. Chopped celery, diced onions, and colorful bell peppers were often added for crunch and freshness, making it both filling and cheerful to look at. The sweetness of the jarred dressing gave the salad a signature flavor that was instantly recognizable, and it was unlike anything made with regular mayonnaise. It felt lively and distinct, which is why people remembered it even decades later. This salad was cheap to make, easy to prepare in large quantities, and versatile enough to serve either as a side dish or as a simple light meal. Children happily scooped it cold out of the refrigerator, husbands paired it with sandwiches for lunch, and neighbors expected to see it sitting proudly on church supper tables. It was dependable, frugal, and endlessly adaptable, which is why it stayed in rotation for so long. For housewives, it was a guaranteed hit that required little more than pantry staples and one simple jar of Miracle Whip. Homemade TV dinner trays were a clever 1960s trick that let families enjoy the novelty of frozen meals without buying expensive store-bought versions. Moms used foil pans to portion leftovers into single servings, freezing them so they could be reheated later. This not only reduced food waste, but also gave busy families quick meals ready for hectic nights. Before microwaves were common, these trays were reheated in the oven, making dinner convenient and organized. For kids, it felt special to have their own individual tray with compartments just like the TV dinners advertised on television. Parents appreciated the savings, since making their own trays cost far less than buying prepackaged meals. It was also a way to stretch Sunday roasts or large batches of stew into multiple dinners during the week. Homemade TV dinners reflected the spirit of the decade, balancing modern convenience with frugal practicality. They stand as an example of how 1960s moms used resourcefulness to give their families the best of both worlds. Leftover meatloaf sandwiches were nothing fancy, but they were a weekday miracle in 70s homes. Housewives knew that one meatloaf could stretch across several meals if handled wisely, and cold slices tucked between bread made school lunches go further. A slab of meatloaf with ketchup on white bread kept kids full, while thinner slices paired with mustard and onion became work lunches for husbands. It was not wasteful, it was resourceful, and everyone felt like they got something different, even though it was the same dish. Housewives often cooked meatloaf in bigger batches for exactly this reason, knowing that leftovers were not a burden but a solution. Sandwiches transformed last night's dinner into today's lunch, which was a small act of clever planning. Families saved money without ever feeling like they were missing out on fresh food. It was frugality disguised as convenience, which is why it stayed popular through the decade. The satisfaction of pulling a ready slice from the fridge and creating a meal in seconds was the reward for thinking ahead. Eggless, milkless, butterless cake was a recipe born of wartime shortages that never really disappeared from church kitchens because it was clever enough to stand on its own. Known sometimes as wacky cake, it relied on vinegar, oil, and baking soda to create lift, with cocoa or spices for flavor. The absence of traditional ingredients made it perfect for times of rationing, but the result was still moist, tender, and satisfying. Church ladies loved it because it could be baked with pantry staples, even when dairy and eggs were scarce or too expensive. It became a dependable cake for bake sales, funerals, and family dinners, often topped with a simple frosting made from powdered sugar and water. What started as a necessity evolved into a tradition, with many families holding on to the recipe even when ingredients were plentiful again. The cake carried with it the memory of resourcefulness, proving that sweetness could be found even in lean times. It was humble, thrifty, and surprisingly delicious, a reminder that cleverness often came from constraint. Soaking wilted lettuce in cold vinegar water was a trick passed down like a whispered kitchen secret. When lettuce started to droop or go soft, it did not get tossed. It got revived. Housewives would fill a bowl with cold water, add a splash of white vinegar, and let the greens soak for 10 to 20 minutes. It crisped them right back up. No waste, no disappointment. This simple trick saved countless salads from being sad or soggy. Before pre-washed greens in bags, lettuce came fresh from the store or garden, and it started wilting fast if not used quickly. But smart homemakers had ways around that. It also helped clean the leaves better than water alone, which was especially important back then. Lettuce was expensive enough without throwing it out before it hit the plate. The result? A crisp, refreshing base for salads that looked and tasted brand new. It may not seem like much today, but in the 1950s, this trick was gold. It kept family meals fresh, appetites satisfied, and budgets intact, all from a little bowl of water and vinegar. No one bragged about it. They just did it. And it worked. Potato boil water for gravy base is one of those tricks that feels too simple to matter until you taste it. When you boil potatoes, the water turns cloudy and thick with starch. Most people pour it down the drain, but the old cooks saved it. That cloudy water was liquid gold, perfect for thickening gravies, stews, or even making a quick roux without needing butter or flour. It added body and just a hint of potato flavor, which paired beautifully with meat scraps or leftover vegetables. It was warm, filling, and somehow made everything else taste richer. You could stir in pan drippings or a spoonful of mustard or vinegar and have something that passed for a real sauce. Nothing fancy, but deeply satisfying. This trick barely shows up in cookbooks today, even though it worked better than some of the thickeners you find on store shelves. It was a quiet skill, one you learned by watching, not by reading. And once you knew it, you never threw out potato water again. Boiled bread dumplings were a Depression lifesaver when meat was gone and vegetables were thin. Families took stale bread, ends or crusts, and soaked them in water or milk until soft. Then they added flour, maybe an egg, and salt or onion. This got rolled into dumplings and boiled until firm. They soaked up broth and stretched soups into meals that could feed 5 instead of 2. The texture was dense, like a sponge that clung to every drop of flavor. Sometimes they were served with just gravy or fat drippings. They were not pretty, but they filled you up and gave the illusion of plenty. And in a time when illusions were all you had, that meant something. Bread dumplings turned trash into dinner, and that was enough. Cornflake coating for fried foods was one of those budget miracles that came out of a box. When breadcrumbs were scarce or you just wanted something different, people turned to cornflakes, those same flakes they poured in a bowl for breakfast each morning. Crushed into fine crumbs and tossed with a little salt or paprika, cornflakes made a crunchy, golden coating that worked on everything from chicken to pork chops to fish sticks. You did not need a deep fryer either, just a baking tray, a little oil, and a hot oven. Some versions used a milk and egg wash first, while others went straight from the cornflake crumbs to the pan. The coating crisped up quickly and stayed put, giving each bite a satisfying crunch. This trick was especially common in the 1950s and 1960s, when convenience met creativity, and boxed cereals found their way into more than just the breakfast table. Kids loved it, adults called it clever, and it quietly became one of the best shortcuts in the American kitchen. Even gluten-free folks today still swear by it. The box said breakfast, but old cookbooks knew better. Jell-O as a leftover preserver may sound like a party trick today, but in the 1950s, it was a serious solution to a serious problem: food waste. Housewives would take leftover vegetables, bits of meat, or even chopped eggs and suspend them in flavored or plain gelatin. The result was a molded salad that kept longer and looked surprisingly elegant on the table. It was not about being fancy. It was about stretching a meal into the next day and keeping it safe without refrigeration on every corner. Jell-O sealed the food in and slowed spoilage, giving families another day or two to use it. You would chill the mold in a shallow dish, pop it out when company came over, and suddenly leftovers became a centerpiece. Some folks raised an eyebrow at ham and lime gelatin, but others swore by it. And when choices were few, you used what worked. Housewives did not flinch. They got creative. It was frugal, clever, and oddly festive. That wobble meant something back then. It meant no waste, full bellies, and a little color on a dinner table that needed cheering up. Bacon grease as a biscuit fat substitute was not just clever, it was common sense. When butter was too pricey or scarce and shortening was rationed, folks used what was already in the pan. Bacon grease, saved in a can or jar near the stove, became the go-to for biscuits, cornbread, and frying. It added depth, richness, and just a hint of smoke. Strained to remove bits, chilled until firm, it worked like lard and made everything taste better. You saw it in Southern cookbooks, recipe cards, and wartime pamphlets. For many, it was just the way things were done, and if someone threw it out, they probably did not grow up cooking. It was humble, it was honest, and it made unforgettable biscuits. Zucchini bread was born out of necessity when church gardens were overflowing with more zucchini than anyone could eat. Instead of letting them go to waste, church ladies grated the extra squash into batter, turning a humble vegetable into a moist and sweet loaf. With cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar, the zucchini blended right in, leaving behind only a soft texture and rich flavor. At bake sales, slices of zucchini bread were wrapped and sold quickly, often becoming one of the most popular items. The cleverness was in transforming an unwanted surplus into something comforting and profitable. Families appreciated it too, because kids who might wrinkle their noses at zucchini happily ate it when it was baked into bread. It was also a frugal trick, since it stretched flour, eggs, and sugar into more servings without using extra costly ingredients. For many, the smell of zucchini bread cooling on the counter became tied to church events and fall harvests. It was proof that nothing needed to go to waste if you had creativity in the kitchen. Sweet, simple, and resourceful, zucchini bread became a classic church recipe for good reason. Cooking beans overnight on the stove was a practice that blended patience, thrift, and practicality in the best possible way. Dried beans were inexpensive, plentiful, and stored well, but they were tough and required long hours of cooking to become tender. To save effort, grandfathers would set heavy pots of beans on the back of the wood stove before going to bed, leaving them to simmer slowly all night. By morning, the beans had softened perfectly, absorbed seasonings, and were ready to feed the entire family without further fuss. This slow simmering method let the beans soak up flavors from onions, garlic, herbs, or even scraps of leftover ham bone tossed into the pot. The smell filled the kitchen by dawn, a comforting reminder that food was waiting for anyone who rose early to begin the day. Beans cooked this way stretched small budgets further, providing protein and nutrition at very low cost. They were served with bread, rice, or potatoes, and the leftovers were reheated for days. It was not glamorous food, but it was hearty and dependable, a true staple in households across America. This clever trick proved patience was often the most powerful kitchen tool. Iceberg lettuce boats looked like diet food, but they were actually a clever way to stretch expensive proteins. Housewives would hollow out big crisp leaves and fill them with cottage cheese, tuna salad, or chopped ham, making one head of lettuce feed a whole family. They appeared on diet plates in diners, but at home they were a showcase of thrift dressed up as something stylish. A tray of these boats made it seem like you had spent hours planning, when in reality it was just a matter of scooping and spooning. They were crisp, fresh, and cheap, which checked every box for a busy mother trying to keep meals interesting. Cottage cheese and canned fruit made them light enough for summer lunches, while ham or tuna made them hearty for a quick dinner. Guests thought they were trendy, kids thought they were fun, and husbands thought they were health conscious, which meant everyone went home happy. It was not about the lettuce at all. It was about the illusion that this was something fresh and new. That was the true genius of 70s cooking tricks, making ordinary food feel like a special creation. Cabbage-stretching ground beef dinners was a trick that spoke directly to the frugal heart of 1960s households. When a pound of beef was not enough to feed everyone, Chopped cabbage was mixed in to bulk up dishes like skillet suppers, casseroles, or even soups. The cabbage softened as it cooked, soaking up flavor from the meat and seasonings, creating a dish that tasted heartier than it really was. This approach let moms serve generous portions while keeping grocery bills under control. It also provided extra nutrition, sneaking vegetables into meals that might otherwise have been light on greens. For kids, it often went unnoticed among the sauce and beef, while parents saw it as a clever way to make a single pound of meat stretch across an entire family dinner. This simple technique became a staple of Depression-era cooking and carried proudly into the 1960s, where thrift and tradition met modern convenience. It is one of those forgotten tricks that shows how a little cabbage could make all the difference when budgets were tight. Orange juice glazed carrots were the kind of dinner party dish that felt fancier than it was. Carrots were cheap and easy to store, but no one really got excited about them until you added a splash of orange juice and a bit of butter. The acid in the juice softened the carrots just right, while the sugars caramelized slightly, giving everything a glossy finish. It made a plain root vegetable taste bright, warm, and a little unexpected. This trick started appearing in cookbooks in the 1950s and really caught on in the 1960s when citrus became a trendy flavor in savory foods. Some cooks added a dash of honey or cinnamon, while others left it clean and simple. It was easy to make, easy to scale for a crowd, and looked beautiful on the plate. This was the kind of side dish that made people feel like they were eating something a little more refined, even when it cost barely $1 to make. A little citrus went a long way, and carrots never looked back. Saving butter wrappers for greasing pans was one of the quietest and cleverest habits in a 1950s kitchen. After using a stick of butter, a housewife would fold the wrapper neatly and store it in the fridge or freezer. When it came time to bake, she would pull it out and use the residue to coat cake tins, cookie sheets, or muffin trays. It gave just enough grease to keep things from sticking, no mess, no waste, and no need for extra butter. You were not wasting a thing. That small swipe of leftover fat did more than you would expect. It smelled like something was about to be baked, even before the oven warmed up. Housewives passed this trick down without thinking, and their daughters folded the wrappers just the same. It was a small act of thrift, but it came from a bigger mindset. Waste nothing, use everything. Even paper soaked in butter had a second life. In homes where every bit counted, even the wrapper had a job to do, and it did it well. Skillet roasting coffee beans at home was an act of love and patience. Before electric roasters and fancy blends, families would buy green coffee beans in bulk and roast them right in their kitchens. A heavy cast iron skillet was all you needed. You kept the beans moving constantly to prevent burning, usually shaking the pan or stirring with a long spoon over medium heat. The smell was smoky, earthy, and almost intoxicating. You had to listen closely for the first crack, that sharp popping sound that told you the roast was beginning. Some people liked a lighter roast, others waited for a darker color and fuller aroma. Once cooled, sometimes wrapped in a damp towel, they were ground by hand or in a manual grinder and brewed fresh. It was a whole process, but it made your morning cup feel earned. Today's coffee comes pre-roasted, pre-ground, and sealed in plastic. But back then, roasting your own beans was a skill that saved money, deepened flavor, and filled the house with the kind of smell that told you the day was starting right. Sour milk biscuits were what happened when nothing could go to waste, not even spoiled milk. In the 1930s, refrigeration was rare and expensive, so milk often turned sour before it could all be used. But instead of tossing it, home cooks put it to work. The acid in the sour milk reacted with baking soda, creating lift and softness in biscuit dough. No need for eggs, no need for fresh buttermilk. You just mixed flour, fat, soda, and that slightly sour milk into a sticky dough and dropped it onto a hot baking sheet. The result was a light, tender biscuit with a subtle tang. Some families added herbs or sugar, depending on what they had. Others used bacon grease instead of butter or skipped salt altogether. These biscuits were eaten with molasses, honey, gravy, or just plain. They were fast, filling, and above all, forgiving. If the milk was on the edge of turning but not gone completely, it was a perfect fit. Sour milk biscuits were one of those practical tricks passed from mother to daughter, a quiet way of making sure nothing got thrown out before it gave all it had. Mashed potato donuts were a wartime favorite that combined comfort, frugality, and just enough indulgence. They started as a way to use up leftover mashed potatoes, especially the cold, sticky kind no one wanted to reheat. Mixed with flour, sugar, eggs, and spices, the dough was rolled out, cut into rings, and fried until golden. The potatoes made them tender on the inside, with a crisp outer shell that held up well to a dusting of powdered sugar or a quick dip in glaze. The texture was somewhere between a cake donut and a fritter, and they were surprisingly filling. These showed up in cookbooks throughout the 1940s and 1950s, usually listed under budget baking or no-waste desserts. They were popular at church events, bake sales, and family breakfasts, where everyone needed something sweet and satisfying. People even used boxed instant mashed potatoes when real ones were in short supply. It was not just about saving money, it was about turning scraps into something worth looking forward to. And in kitchens where not a spoonful could be wasted, these donuts made every bite count. Homemade pudding mix jars were a quiet kind of genius, a way to make dessert on demand without buying packaged brands. Church ladies would blend sugar, cornstarch, cocoa, and powdered milk into neat jars or tins, ready to be cooked with water or fresh milk when needed. This meant families could whip up a sweet treat in minutes without running to the store. It was thrifty because the bulk ingredients cost less than pre-made mixes, and it was satisfying because the flavors were richer. Vanilla and chocolate were the most common, but there were endless variations depending on what was on hand. These jars lined cupboards and were shared as gifts at church events, wrapped in cloth with recipes tied on. The idea was both practical and personal, making desserts feel homemade even when the steps were simple. At potlucks, puddings made from these mixes often appeared in pies or parfaits, and no one could tell they came from a jarred shortcut. It was about preparing ahead of time, making sure sweetness was always within reach. Clever, economical, and heartfelt, these mixes became a tradition of love as much as thrift. Stuffed bell peppers with rice were the ultimate thrifty oven dish. Housewives stretched a small amount of ground meat by mixing it with rice, tomato sauce, and seasonings, stuffing it all into colorful peppers. What might have been only enough for two became a meal for an entire family. Baking them together let the flavors mingle, turning cheap ingredients into a dish that felt warm and complete. It was filling, economical, and surprisingly impressive when placed on the table. Housewives knew that recipes like this were about more than saving money. They were about creating meals that carried pride. It became a regular weeknight dinner that required very little but delivered a lot. Families walked away satisfied, and the kitchen stayed under budget. It was a shining example of how thrift and flavor met in perfect harmony in 70s kitchens. Coffee can ice cream was as much about the fun as it was about the dessert itself. At church picnics, children and adults would roll sealed coffee cans filled with cream, sugar, and flavoring back and forth across the grass until the mixture froze. It was simple science and community entertainment rolled into one. This trick did not require an ice cream machine or electricity, which made it perfect for outdoor events. Everyone got to participate, laughing as they pushed and shook the cans. When the lids were finally pried off, the reward was a sweet homemade ice cream that tasted better for all the effort behind it. Flavors could be as simple as vanilla or as playful as chocolate chips tossed in at the end. Church ladies loved how it brought people together because the process was just as important as the final dish. It turned dessert into an activity which made it unforgettable for the children who grew up with it. Looking back, coffee can ice cream was not just about thrift, but about joy. It was a perfect picture of community in action. Bread crust pie lattice was the ultimate make-do solution for bakers who hated to waste a single scrap. Instead of tossing out the crusts from sliced sandwich bread, especially the heels, home cooks braided or layered them across the top of a pie. You would soak the crusts briefly in a little milk or brush them with melted butter to soften them up, then shape them into rustic strips. They would toast up golden in the oven and give the pie a rough, homemade charm that you just could not fake. It was not flaky like traditional crust, but it held its shape and added a chewy, buttery layer to each slice. This trick showed up in Depression era and wartime cookbooks as a way to conserve flour, since making a second crust from scratch was not always an option. It worked best on fruit pies or pudding pies that needed a topping but did not require full coverage. You would be surprised how many old-timers still remember this with a kind of fondness. Those scrappy little pies made with crusts no one wanted. And the best part? It actually tasted pretty good. Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Cold water shrinking for pie shells is one of those clever tricks almost lost to time. When you blind bake a pie crust, baking it without filling, it tends to puff or slump. Today, people use weights or beans to hold it in place. But back then, you would drop the shell briefly into a bowl of cold water just before baking. The sudden chill made the dough contract, hugging the pan tighter and holding its shape. It was a small act with a big result. No gadgets, no guesswork, just a bowl of cold water, a steady hand, and a bit of faith. This method worked especially well for custard pies or fruit pies that needed a crisp bottom. It also prevented bubbling and cracking, something even experienced bakers still fight with. You would not find this tip in many modern cookbooks. It was more likely to be passed from grandmother to granddaughter with a wink. Sometimes the simplest answers are the ones we forget first. Using dish towels to proof bread was a trick rooted in simplicity and trust. Before plastic wrap and modern proofing boxes, 1950s housewives would set their bread dough in a bowl, cover it with a clean kitchen towel, and find the warmest corner of the kitchen. The towel kept the dough safe from drafts, dust, and drying out. It also breathed, allowing the yeast to rise properly without trapping too much moisture. You could fold it gently over the bowl and check back an hour later to see the magic happen. Proofing bread was never about high-tech tools. It was about warmth, patience, and rhythm. The dish towel was part of that ritual. Every good baking day began with the smell of yeast and a soft cotton cloth ready to cover the future loaf. Housewives had a feel for timing that no machine could match. They watched dough rise like it was an old friend returning home. And the towel was more than fabric. It was a part of the process, passed down through habit and handed across generations. Crustless onion pie was a Depression dish that found a way to taste rich without spending a dime on extras. The crust was left out to save on flour and fat, and instead, the filling became the star. Chopped onions were sautéed in grease, layered into a pan, and covered with a mixture of eggs, flour, and water or milk, whatever was available. Sometimes a bit of cheese or herbs made it in, but most of the time it was just plain, seasoned with salt and pepper. It baked into something soft, savory, and incredibly satisfying. The onions caramelized slightly, giving the dish a natural sweetness that balanced the richness of the eggs. It was served sliced like a pie, though it felt more like a casserole or a crustless quiche. Perfect for dinner or even breakfast, and always appreciated for how cheap and clever it was. It could feed many with little and gave a sense of fullness that lasted. Crustless onion pie was proof that frugal did not have to mean flavorless. Cucumber vinegar soaks were a quick way to brighten the table when fresh vegetables were hard to come by. Church ladies sliced cucumbers thin, tossed them into vinegar and sugar, and left them to chill. After just a short soak, the cucumbers took on a crisp, tangy flavor that worked perfectly alongside heavy casseroles or fried meats. The sharpness of the vinegar balanced out starchy or greasy dishes, making meals feel lighter and fresher. During summer potlucks, bowls of these cucumbers were always emptied fast because they were refreshing and simple. It was an inexpensive side that felt new every time, no matter how often it appeared. The trick was that the vinegar kept the cucumbers firm and flavorful, so they could be made ahead without going limp. Families often passed around jars of these during hot months, and many recipes appeared in community cookbooks. Kids grew up expecting that every picnic table would have a plate of them. They were not just salad, but a cooling relief in the middle of sweltering afternoons. It was proof that even the simplest tricks could feel like a luxury when done with care. Frozen pea soup hack was the kind of shortcut that only a practical 70s housewife could have dreamed up. Instead of spending hours simmering fresh vegetables, she would simply blend a bag of frozen peas into a pot of cream soup. The result was an instant burst of color and sweetness that made it look and taste homemade without the time or expense. This trick turned a plain can of cream of mushroom or cream of chicken into something lively, green, and nourishing. Housewives leaned on it for weeknight dinners when schedules were packed with school, chores, and community events. Guests thought it was thoughtful cooking, but in reality, it was thrift and convenience at its best. Frozen peas were cheap, plentiful, and stored well, making them one of the most reliable ingredients in the freezer aisle. With one whirl of a blender, an ordinary soup became a dinner centerpiece, fooling both family and visitors alike. It was cleverness in a pot, served hot and steaming with bread on the side. Flour and salt meat stretchers were not about taste. They were about survival and smart thinking. When a pound of meat had to feed 6 or 7 people, there was no room for waste. Home cooks would mix the meat with a cup or two of flour, sometimes seasoned with pepper or dried herbs, and add a heavy pinch of salt. That mixture got turned into patties, crumbles, or meatballs. The flour made it stick together, and the salt helped pull out the flavor from the scraps of beef or pork. Sometimes an egg was added, sometimes not. Fried in a pan or baked in a loaf tin, it held its shape and filled the plate. Kids did not ask what was in it. They were just glad to have a warm dinner with something meaty at the center. These stretchers kept food on the table long after the groceries had run out. You will not find this trick in today's glossy cookbooks. Nobody wants to admit that flour can make meat go twice as far, but ask anyone who lived through the hard years, and they will tell you it was a trick worth knowing. Homemade cracker crumbs for coating meat were the breadcrumb before breadcrumbs. If a housewife ran out of store-bought crumbs or never bought them in the first place, she reached for a sleeve of saltines. Crushed finely with a rolling pin or the bottom of a glass, the crackers became a crispy coating for chicken cutlets, pork chops, or even fried tomatoes. They stuck well, browned beautifully, and brought a savory crunch to whatever hit the skillet. You could season the crumbs or leave them plain, depending on the dish. Saltines were cheap, shelf-stable, and always on hand, which made them perfect for coating duty. Housewives made it look easy, and it was. It also meant no waste, since stale crackers were even better for the job. These crumbs were humble, but they worked hard. And in a time where every part of the pantry had a purpose, they earned their place at the table. Wilted lettuce salad was not just about saving soggy greens. It was about making the most of what the garden gave, even past its prime. When lettuce started to wilt in the heat or after a few days indoors, families did not toss it. Instead, they poured hot bacon grease mixed with vinegar over the top, reviving the leaves into something tender and flavorful. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough, and the vinegar gave it a punch of brightness. Bits of onion or crumbled bacon were added when possible, but the core of the dish was that sizzling pour. It turned tired lettuce into a warm salad with more depth than any cold dressing could offer. You did not need much to make it feel special. It was a moment when something old felt new again. In a time of extreme frugality, it captured the mindset perfectly. Do not throw it out. Just use it differently. Wilted lettuce was not a fallback. It was a quiet trick that helped people feel like they still had a choice at the table. Boiled salad dressing was the grandmother of everything that came before the grocery aisle. Back before bottled ranch or ready-made vinaigrettes, home cooks whipped up dressings from scratch using what they had in the pantry. This particular one was a little tangy, a little sweet, and usually started with vinegar, sugar, egg yolks, and a bit of mustard powder. Everything was whisked together in a saucepan and cooked low until it thickened like a custard. The result was creamy and tart, perfect for potato salad, coleslaw, or even spooned over hard-boiled eggs. Some versions added flour or cornstarch to help it hold better in the fridge, while others kept it simple. It might not have had the smooth pour of modern dressings, but it had soul and a flavor people still remember. You would find it tucked into the back pages of church cookbooks, labeled Grandma's Dressing or Sweet Egg Sauce. When chilled, it firmed up a little, which made it ideal for picnic salads that had to last in the summer sun. It tasted like resourcefulness, it tasted like memory, and it was surprisingly good. Making soup from scraps was a tradition built on necessity and thrift. Onion skins, carrot tops, celery leaves, and bones that others might throw away were collected and simmered into broths. Nothing was wasted, and every bit of flavor was coaxed from ingredients that seemed past their usefulness. Grandfathers knew that scraps still carried value, and a pot of soup could feed a family with hardly any fresh ingredients. The broth would simmer slowly, filling the house with comforting aromas that belied its humble beginnings. Vegetables, noodles, or grains were often added to turn the broth into a full meal. This practice meant fewer trips to the market and more meals from the same supply. It was not only practical but also a reminder of resourcefulness in hard times. Families ate well because someone knew how to turn scraps into sustenance. Soup from scraps may sound simple today, but it was once a mark of clever survival in the kitchen. Oatmeal meatloaf filler was one of the thriftiest tricks church ladies ever leaned on, and it made perfect sense for families watching every penny. Instead of using up all the ground beef at once, rolled oats were mixed in to bulk out the loaf. The oats absorbed the meat's juices, stretching flavor while keeping the texture moist. It was a way to turn a pound of beef into a meal that could feed far more than it should have. For families with hungry children and guests at the table, this meant fewer empty stomachs and less money spent at the butcher. The oats themselves were cheap, easy to store, and endlessly versatile, making them a staple in every pantry. At church suppers, oatmeal-filled meatloaf was quietly common, though no one called attention to it. What mattered was that everyone got a fair slice. For many, it tasted just as hearty as the all-meat version, and the trick became part of the recipe handed down. What began as a way to survive hardship turned into a tradition of clever thrift. It was not just about saving meat, but about feeding people with dignity and ingenuity. Those were 100 cooking tricks that ordinary American home cooks discovered the hard way, through burnt pots, empty cupboards, and feeding a family on next to nothing. Some of these are 100 years old and still work better than anything in a modern cookbook. If your mother or grandmother taught you a kitchen shortcut that nobody else seems to remember, put it in the comments. Those secrets deserve to be passed on. Subscribe so you never miss the next one, and we will see you in the next video.